Welcome to the AFGHANEYE YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another AFGHANEYE Live. I'm your host Sangar Paikar.
I'm ahmed-waleed Karkar. First of all, sorry guys, we're a bit late, but if you know Afghans, you know that that's nothing unusual. In fact, if we were on time, you should probably be worried. But let's just wait for 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to come on. And when I say 1 or 2 minutes, I mean 1 or 2 minutes. Sangar, if you could tweet out the link.
I just did.
Tweet it out again. Everyone here, we've got 33 people here. Because we're being quick, I'm gonna have to compromise my manners. Please be quick in liking the video. Please be quick in sharing it on every social media, because for those of you that aren't aware and or who didn't pay attention to the poster, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and if you're in Britain, as I am, that means that anniversary is going to end in about 1 hour and 50 something minutes. So yeah, please, Darab Qureshi, thank you for retweeting it already. Please tweet it again if it isn't too much hassle. So just as you found out about us, more people can find out about us. Osama Qayyum, I am really sorry. We are not going to be discussing what Sana Safi said about the Bukra of today in Kabul University. In fact, we're not going to be discussing Kabul University at all, maybe just in the footnotes. Today's topic for everyone that is watching is discussing the last 20 years of war in Afghanistan. From the beginning, we're going to take a deep dive in right at the beginning to see how this system, this democratic Islamic Republic, was instituted, where and how it went wrong, when it went wrong, and we're going to walk you through it and its various contradictions. And we can say now, we're not going to get attacked now, I hope, for talking about contradictions, because if it wasn't contradictory, it wouldn't have collapsed. So please, guys, before we do get into that, please let's tweet out the link, because I feel personally, I'll be honest with you, right? I was absolutely shattered today, right? I did a lot of exercise. I had a lot on. I was reading a lot. But you know what? As 10 p.m. approached, I noticed that my energy level started to spike with it. Sangar, would you agree with that?
I had a similar experience last night when I went to the gym. When I was back, I was totally destroyed. And then after a while, I had some chicken biryani with lots of green chili. And then suddenly I felt like I just woke up. I was like totally excited. It's weird. I don't understand, but okay. So guys,
Sangar, you know what? I know you're older than me, and I shouldn't, but I'm gonna request you, please tweet out the link again and again, as many times as you can. There's no limit, because we want to get into this ASAP, and up until we start getting 200-300 people, that's going to take a bit of a while. Not a while, but I would rather get them sooner rather than later. And Khan is saying, please expose Sana Safi and Yalda Hakim. Like I said today, we are not going to be talking about the events of today. We're not going to be talking about the Kabul University, the women in hijab, or the controversy over their hijab. That is not on the agenda for today. We are going to be talking about how the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, that lasted from, I can't believe I'm saying this, Sangar, but it lasted from 2004 to 2021, the 17 years republic, how it was instituted, where and how it went wrong, and we're going to be talking through it for up until its collapse. So, Sangar تقبلت سنگه شوي ورزي بخير تيجي.
بس الحمد لله مصروفیم. خب بس شوي ورزي ختيريجي. تتسنگه.
والله فضل دختر دکم شکایت ندارم مصروفم میو خوب.
Okay. Maiwand Ahmad Zai, welcome. Mujib Sadat. Muzim
Basir Karkar.
Muin Abdul Hadi. Junaid Khan, Basir Kakar, Nangarhari M, Osama Qayyum, regular guest, Darab Qureshi. All of you, very, very welcome. Ibrar Roha, everyone, it's always a pleasure to have you all with us.
You know, we just got the customary religious question. When is Dajjal coming, guys? I don't know. Consult your mufti, and even he wouldn't know.
Yeah, yeah, but
So,
don't go to YouTube asking about Dajjal, looking for Dajjal, because then you will find Dajjal. Uh, his name is Imran Nazar Hussain from Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, guys, let's start because it's taking too long, and before we know, it's no longer September the 11th. So, Ahmed-waleed Kakar, my dear friend, where were you on September the 11th, 2001?
well, I came back from school, right? And I just saw, you know, the usual. I don't even want to say the usual because it wasn't usual back then. These two towers going up in smoke. It was billowing with smoke, and I was like, "What's going on?" And back then, we obviously didn't know who did it, why, what happened,
You saw it on TV.
etc. Saw it on
Yeah,
TV.
yeah.
What about you?
I wasn't at home. I was actually in a bus on my way from the train station to somewhere, I think towards my home. Back then, I used to live in Tilburg. It's a city in the south of the Netherlands. I
Yes.
remember exactly what I was wearing. I was wearing a black shirt, dress shirt, black jeans, white Nike Air Max. That was my regular uniform every day. I would wear
2000, early 2000s
2001. Yeah,
swag.
yeah, 2001. I was sitting in the back of the bus with my Nokia telephone, and somebody called me and said, uh, the Twin Towers in New York have been attacked.
Hmm.
So I was like, what? And then when I came home, I saw it on TV, and I was shocked. And to tell you something very interesting, back then I was about, I don't know, I was 18, 19 years old. I'm not sure how old I was back then, but I was a young man. I'm still am, but back then I was a young
Some
man.
things don't change.
No, some
The
things never
fountain
change.
of youth.
You
The
know,
fountain of youth. Some of us have it, some of us
yeah.
don't.
So back then, I was a very angry young man because I felt like there were these embargoes in Afghanistan. You could sanctions. You could not even import aspirins in Afghanistan. Food
Okay.
could not be even imported. Nothing. So a lot
Mhm.
of people were suffering. Our relatives, our family who lived in Kabul, like my grandfather died in hospital due to
Third Europe,
lack of,
actually.
I mean, due to the lack of medication, everything. Every day we heard about how so many people are suffering, and I was very angry back then. I was very
I think
anti-Western,
that's
and
it's noticeable because you came from sort of a left-leaning background, so you
yeah,
wouldn't have necessarily even sympathized with the Taliban regime at the time. But
exactly,
sanctions hurt everyone, irrespective of their political affiliations. And
exactly.
now that we're talking about sanctions again, I think that's a pertinent point. Even the people on the ground or their relatives abroad that hate the current regime,
Yeah.
they're still going to suffer from it.
And that's exactly the point. Is that 20 years ago, as I remember it, not just us, not just my family,
I just
but
want to
many.
say, Killer Khan is in the chat saying, "I'm so happy Sangar is no longer angry."
Yeah, it's true. I've spent time with Jamaat Tabligh, and I learned how to manage my emotions and anger and everything. So I'm a man of peace now. Uh,
Alhamdulillah.
but back then I was really angry. Like when I heard that this happened, and I was like, yes, those bastards. Just that was my emotion as a 18, 19-year-old guy. And I had some arguments with some of my Dutch friends, and they were saying, Sangar, but do you realize what you're saying is actually terrible? And I was like, Yeah, actually, yeah, it doesn't make sense. You know, it's not good that it happened. You know, innocent people died.
Self-introspection is something you
Yeah.
had back then.
But you know, the good thing was is that my friends, the Dutch guys I used to hang out with, they were also trying to understand where I'm coming from, like what I'm trying to say. Like, okay, we understand your sentiments, but these guys killed 3,000 people. That doesn't make sense. And I was like, okay, yes, I acknowledge I don't support that, but you know that frustration that you have, and that was one side of it, and the other side was that the next day after 9/11, I was at school. I was attending this college. It was a terrible college, but we were sitting in class, and in front of me, all the students, everyone was just sharing their emotions about what happened. And there was this blonde girl, I still remember her. She was sitting right in front of me because, you know, we don't have segregated classes in the Netherlands. And the
The
teacher,
Taliban would be
yeah,
very angry
yes,
to hear about.
yeah. So the teacher was asking everyone, "What do you feel? What do you think?" And when it was her turn, she said, "I hope they drop an atomic bomb on Afghanistan." And I was like, "What?" I said, "Yo, I am from Afghanistan, so you're saying that all of my people should die because of your sentiments?" And you know, obviously, I spoke in a very
It wasn't
aggressive.
that kind, was it?
No, no, no. So when I said that, the teacher he was like, "Oh, Sanger, please be considerate. Where you have to be very considerate of her emotions." I was like, "What the hell? Her emotions? She wants to basically massacre all Afghans because what happened in New York, and you are asking me to be considered. Why aren't you saying that to her?" So that naturally, that's one of the reasons why I left that college, because terrible teachers. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it was a very emotional experience for me, and it also transformed me personally, my ideas, my views, my perspective about Afghanistan, and what my role is as an individual in society, how I see myself. Was it the same for you?
So yeah, so I remember. So I, like I said, the tower. So I went onto the TV. The towers are sort of gone up in smoke, and we didn't really know what what who had done it and why it had happened, and it was just like, bad things happened, whatever. But then in the following days, I went to school, and it was sort of a thing like, oh, like this, it was done by Afghanistan, like people from Afghanistan. And I was just like, yo, I was 6, by the way, okay? Now, like, so
Politically
just
conscious
for
6-year-old.
so just to put that out there, in case anyone is like, yo, this guy would really had no clue. I was 6, okay? So it was like, people from Afghanistan have done this. And like when I was growing up, I sort of learned English after I learned Pashto, okay? We lived with my grandmother at home, okay? So Pashto was the language at home. And when I sort of went to nursery or to school, initially I struggled with the English. It is my first language, because funnily enough, not English, right? But even despite
You
that,
wouldn't
it wasn't.
say.
Even despite that, it's not. It was like I didn't really know what Afghanistan was. I didn't really bother to ask why I was an Afghan living in London, other than bad things that happened in my country. And I remember I went over and I looked at the map and I was like, you know what? Now's the time to find out like where Afghanistan is on the map. So I looked at it on the map and I was really disappointed. I was like, what the hell? It's so small. And then I looked at America. I was like, America's so big. Like, how could we do something to that? Like, we're that strong, kind of thing. But they were like, yeah, the Afghans have done this. And I was just sort of sat there in the corner of the classroom. Like, we used to sort of sit on the floor. It was like the mats. It was primary school. I was just sort of sat in the corner and thinking, well, this is awkward. I didn't apologize for it. But after that, growing up, it was like, Afghanistan got invaded in 2003 at the age of 8. I went to Afghanistan. I went to Kandahar alone, and it was peaceful back then. But it didn't remain very.
Did you go on your own to Kandahar when you were 8?
No, I went with
Okay.
family. We stayed there, and that was when that
Now,
sort
now
of
I
really.
understand when you say English is not your first language.
So I went there, and that was really what sort of made me realize, like, yo, damn, I'm kind of from a different country. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
And then after that, like, even in but then in secondary school, it was really when it started. Like, like I went to a school in which it was predominantly ethnic minority. Okay, and a lot of them, like, where are you from? You're Afghan. Ha, Bin Laden, right? And I was like, yo, Bin Laden is Saudi, I'm Afghan. But, it was like a joke, Afghan suicide bombers, whatever, whatever, whatever. And it wasn't something that I took too seriously personally. I remember I did used to get angry, but it's not like I'm not going to sit here and talk about how it damaged my mental health and all of that sort of thing. But the point is that the war of the last 20 years, I was 6, right? I was 6 when 9/11 happened. Now I'm 26. And the two things that are similar is the fact that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan. But now they're in an even stronger position than they were in 2001. And I think we should, on that note, take it to 2001. So, Sangar, 9/11 happens, and then we get invaded. What really, I don't know, what are your thoughts? I don't know how to phrase this question.
Let me
What are your thoughts on?
let me just give you guys a little bit of background, okay? What happened on 9/11? Prior to that, there were a lot of tensions, okay? Uh, First, you had in 1998. Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, he apparently had problem, an extramarital relationship with a certain woman. Basically, Bill Clinton was the Mullah Landai of the White House, Fazil Fazli. He did some bad things. And in order to basically drive the attention of the media away from his scandal, he sent cruise missiles to Khost. Okay, so that was the first initial American attack on Afghanistan because of Bin Laden. Okay, and everybody was aware of it back then. That it's ridiculous that he's in a scandal because he cheated on his wife, and he just goes and randomly attacks a village somewhere in Khost, and there were a lot of tensions between the Taliban regime, the Americans. Hillary Clinton was very heavily involved in advocating for Afghan women. I remember, I think it was Mullah Zaif who wrote an op-ed where he said that, Hillary Clinton is so concerned about women in Afghanistan, maybe she should take care of her own rights because her own husband is violating her rights. So it was a very interesting time. And what's also very important is that while all these tensions were going on, there were also efforts by the Americans and the Taliban to work on the oil pipeline from Turkmenistan through Pakistan. So it was a very confusing time, and I was very young. I hadn't read a lot of books. I didn't understand much about world politics. I just understood that Afghanistan is in a very bad situation. And once the attacks happened, most people assume that it's bin Laden because of his threats, because of the attacks in Nairobi, because of the Americans' insistence on arresting him, and they demanded that the Taliban surrender bin Laden, but they refused. So this is why most people immediately assumed that bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. And back at that time, a lot of people couldn't really understand how it's possible, and people couldn't make a distinction between bin Laden, the Saudi billionaire who has sought refuge in Afghanistan, and the Taliban regime. Because let me make it very clear, Osama bin Laden didn't come to Afghanistan as part of the Taliban regime, he already had an Afghan passport that was issued to him by none other than Burhanuddin Rabbani,
Professor Saib.
professor of the leader of Jamiat Islami, the same party that was part of the government in the last 20 years. So that's how bin Laden entered Afghanistan. And from outside back, we are frustrated with all the ignorance and misinformation about Afghanistan now in the media. But back then it was even worse. Everyone around the world thought that people in Afghanistan all speak Arabic. Okay? So there was a lot of ignorance on the side of Western diplomats and politicians and security experts. The whole counterterrorism industry didn't exist. The countering violent extremism industry didn't exist. All of these things didn't exist back then. And when the attacks happened, the day right after the attack, a lot of people, my parents, other Afghans that I knew, they were all saying, okay, this means that they will now retaliate, most likely attack Afghanistan.
And on that note, it is useful to say, so the Americans, now we're diving into it, guys. Diving into it alert. Please like the video and share it on your socials, because just as you perceive that you benefit from this video, why shouldn't others? Let's not be, let's not be selfish. But in any case, so essentially, what happens is that the Americans issue this threat of close all of these Al-Qaeda camps, let us monitor them, give us all of these terrorists, etc., etc. Now, obviously, for Mullah Omar, this wasn't acceptable because it was a violation of sovereignty, because he didn't really consider himself to be an inferior of the US. He was the Amir of a sovereign state, just like the United States was a sovereign state. But there was obviously room for compromise. But essentially, that compromise didn't really work out. On top of that, the US actually tried to manipulate and create divisions within the Taliban. So they spoke to Mullah Ubaidullah Akhund, who was the Al-Quzay defense minister of the Taliban's emirate, right? And they were basically trying to sow division amongst the Taliban with regard to getting bin Laden to be extradited to the US. So the issue of, and this is actually something that was brought to my attention by Sayyid Ibrahim, who was one of our previous guests in this podcast where we talked about the Taliban. I give credit where it's due. I hadn't actually thought about it like that before. He sort of made me attentive towards it. And so the issue of bin Laden's extradition became one of unity for the Taliban itself. Furthermore, the ISI, I believe, under Director General Mahmoud Ahmad, actually visited Kandahar, which was the de facto capital of Afghanistan, which gives me much joy. No, I'm joking. But it was Mahmoud Ahmad visited Mullah Omar in Kandahar and basically said, the Americans are bluffing, okay? Just give it some time, see what happens. The Americans found out about that, and they basically exerted a lot of pressure on the Pakistanis to basically change their personnel at the ISI. And so now let's get into it, Sankar. Tayar ye?
Yes, let's go.
Sure. So the Americans, basically, they invaded Afghanistan, and on the 17th of November, Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani came to Kabul, which had been either liberated or occupied or invaded, whichever word you want to use. It had the forces of the Northern Alliance were in Kabul. Burhanuddin Rabbani declared himself president. Now, why did he declare himself president? Because after 1992, he was the internationally and technically legally recognized president of the Islamic State of Afghanistan. Now, obviously, back then, Daesh didn't exist, so everyone else relax. It's not the same Islamic State. But Burhanuddin Rabbani was internationally recognized as the president, and the president in exile, heading a government in exile. And only Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia recognized the Taliban's emirate as the lawful representative of the Afghan people internationally. Now, obviously, different countries had relations with the Taliban. China had relations with the Taliban. The US had contacts with the Taliban. The British had contacts with the Taliban. None of them actually gave them official recognition. It was just these three countries. So Burhanuddin Rabbani essentially became the president once again in reality in Kabul. Now, obviously, he was pressurized out of that, right? And he was pressurized out of that because in Bonn, in Germany, there was something that we have now known as the Bonn Conference going on. And that was essentially supposed to decide the course that the new Afghan Republic was going to take after the ousting of the Taliban and so on and so forth. It was basically, this was to function as the blueprint under which Afghanistan would come under the sort of the authority of a new government, a government that would be friendly to the West, to America, a government that would uphold, we were told, the rights of its people. These are obviously not my opinions. I'm just sort of talking about it in generic terms as it was understood at the time. At the time, I was 6 years old, so I didn't really have these opinions. So this was this government was supposed to sort of be a new chapter for Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion and occupation, after the government of Dr. Najib, the Mujahideen civil war, and then all of that reached basically its apex. Like in terms of just pure tragedy, it was seen to have reached its apex internationally under the regime of this, what we were told, barbaric, puritanical, Wahhabi, Salafi, Deobandi Taliban. That was basically the bottom of the pit. And now was the time for the international community to basically say, hey, sorry, Afghanistan, we abandoned you. Now we're going to give you a helping hand up. Now we're going to basically help you to stand on your own 2 feet. And in 2021, that sounds ironic because anything but happened. But that was what the Bonn Conference was. Now, the Bonn Conference, essentially, it featured a lot of negotiations, right? The Pakistanis had their input in the Bonn Conference. The Americans had theirs. The Germans had theirs. The Iranians had theirs. So the Iranians, for example, were opposed to the restoration of the monarchy. You had what was known as the Rome Group. Now, the Rome Group was called the Rome Group because Ali Hazrat Muhammad Zahir Shah, after 1973, the former Afghan king, had taken exile in Rome. Okay, so his group were also present in these negotiations. In 1983, the former king Zahir Shah had basically said that a lawyer jirga, or a grand tribal Afghan assembly, should basically decide the fate of the nation. This was obviously during the peak of the Soviet invasion, right? So whilst Zahir Shah was not politically active in the sense of trying to recruit soldiers and whatever, he never really disappeared. So you had his group, the Rome Group. You had what was known as the Northern Alliance, or Shura-e-Nizar. Shura-e-Nizar basically means the Council of Supervisors, right? And that was the organization that was established by what was then the late Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda operatives on the 9th of September, and his successors, the people from generally his socio-economic, political, geographical background, headed what was known as Shura-e-Nizar. And they were the people who basically fought against the Taliban, and we could consider them the main victors of the post-2001 setup. They were basically put in power thanks to US sort of airstrikes, help, aid, support. So you had the Rome Group, you had Ahmad Shah Massoud's group, right?
And there
then
was
you
a
had
Cyprus group.
there was a Cyprus group.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us more about that, Sangar?
Uh, if you want, please,
Yeah,
you can
sure.
go ahead. Please go ahead.
I mean, the thing with the Cyprus group is that they weren't really that sort of important in that sense. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
By the way, it's worth mentioning here as well, Hamid Karzai had links, Hamid Karzai was to become the president of Afghanistan, had links with what's it called? The Rome Group. Hamid Karzai was basically a staunch monarchist. The Taliban, at the initial phases of the start of their movement, were open to the idea of the restoration of the monarchy. Okay, So Hamid Karzai, we could say, was somewhat affiliated with the Rome group. Now, what happened after that is obviously very interesting. And you had the Pakistanis who were basically, from the very beginning, they tried to prevent an invasion of Afghanistan by the Americans. They basically tried to tell the Americans, look, give us time. We'll exert pressure on the Taliban to extradite bin Laden. Al Qaeda and the Taliban are separate. The Pakistanis were also saying, you know what, maybe you should accommodate the Taliban in this new setup, right? Maybe you should have moderate Taliban in this setup. And the Pakistanis are basically saying, you know what, you need to have more Pashtuns in this setup because Shorai-e-Nizar was dominated by Farsi Banan. Now, why would Pakistan basically insist on some level of Pashtun representation? Well, because Shorai-e-Nizar was basically an ethnic party and it was very heavily backed by India. Okay, so the Pakistanis, with regard to Pashtuns in Afghanistan, either they're going to have Pashtun nationalists who would lay claim to half of their territory, or they'd have, we'd say, more moderate Pashtuns or religiously inclined Pashtuns. And those religiously inclined Pashtuns came in the form of the Taliban as well as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, right? They were seen as a good way to basically ensure some level of stability on the Durand line, as well as basically not exacerbate Pakistan's Pashtun nationalism problem, with which we can all agree it's always struggled, right? So that was basically the sort of what was going on with regard to the Bonn conference. Now, in the Bonn conference, Shorai-e-Nizar actually had a policy of looking for a Pashtun leader. Now, why? Well, because Shorai-e-Nizar was basically an ethnic party, and most of its leadership came from a place in Afghanistan that's recently made the headlines. It's called Panjshir. It was then a district in Parwan, north of Kabul. It was famous for resisting the Soviets. So Panjshir was basically the home of many of the leadership of Shorai-e-Nizar. Now, Shorai-e-Nizar obviously knew the bad optics of a new government basically being dominated not just by one ethnicity, but by one valley of a province north of Kabul. So they basically thought, you know what, it would be useful to have some sort of symbolic Pashtun leadership whilst we control the reins of power, right? And that Pashtun, Hamid Karzai, was not just any Pashtun, he was a Popalzai. His father, Abdul Ahad Karzai, my grandfather actually knew him. He was a parliamentarian in the Afghan parliament. We were friends to some extent. We had an acquaintance with sort of the nobility of Kandahar under Zahir Shah. So Abdul Ahad Karzai was a tribal Popalzai leader. They're from an area in Kandahar called Kars, which is famous for its sort of fruits and whatever, but Karzai as in the son of Kars, right? So they were a prominent family, but they were also from the Popalzai tribe, from which Ahmad Shah Baba, or Ahmad Shah Durrani, was also a member and the chief. So Shorai-e-Nizar,
Speaking of royalty, we have a super chat from Kilakam 1999. Thank you very much. The only solution to Afghanistan is a return to the Mohammedzai monarchy. Okay,
what do you make of that, Sengar?
Let's just say we will discuss this at length at some other point. But you were saying Karzai was a Popalzai.
Karzai was a Popalzai, and so Karzai was a Popalzai, and Shorai-e-Nizar obviously understood that there was some level of extra credibility that they would gain by having Karzai on site. Now, does that mean someone is saying Waleed is part of the Kandari aristocracy? But in any case, so Shorai-e-Nizar obviously knew this. Now, obviously, is this because of the goodness of their heart? No, it's shrewd politics, right? Now, the thing is that Karzai, as a person, was part of Mujaddidi's Hizb. I always forget, is Mujaddidi's Hizb was Mahaz, right?
No.
I always get him and Pir Said.
Gilani. Mahaz is Gilani.
I always get the two, but he was basically, for those who don't know, Mujaddidi was basically descended from a illustrious family of Sufi sheikhs of the Naqshbandi tariqa, who about in the 16th century became known as Mujaddidi, as in the renewers or the revivalists, because of the perceived decadence of the Naqshbandi tariqa in and around Sirhind in India. They were of Arab ancestry, but they had migrated from India. Okay. And Mujahideen's hizb, I just remembered, was Jabhir Nijat Milli, the Front for National Salvation. But in any case, so he was sort of a more moderate leader, traditionalist, a monarchist. Because the Mujahideens themselves had benefited from the royal family, they wanted a reinstatement of the royal status quo. Karzai was the spokesman for Mujaddidi. He was the deputy foreign minister at some stage. So that is basically Karzai situated in and around this complex. Now, here's the thing. In the Bonn conference on the 5th of December, Karzai is in Shah Wali Court in Kandahar negotiating with the Taliban. And he gets a call basically saying, hey, you've been selected as the interim leader of the transitional Afghan government. On the 6th of December, Karzai, the Taliban basically surrendered to Karzai 4 of the remaining provinces under their control. And Karzai essentially told them, you know what, I'll give you an amnesty that extends even to Mullah Omar. Now, I think it was the next day that Donald Rumsfeld said there will be no amnesty, there will be no surrender, and we're going to shoot and hunt all of these guys down or drag them to Guantanamo.
You know, it sounds almost like those spam emails you receive that from Nigerian princes that I've selected you to give you all my family's inheritance. Karzai received a message. Now you're the president. So it's incredible how a relatively obscure politician suddenly is being bombarded to the president.
And we mentioned this in our podcast with Suzanne Schroeder. We basically said that Karzai's only qualification for the presidency was his ethnic tribal background. Now, here's the thing. Karzai, in the late 90s, I believe, had actually donated $50,000 to the Taliban. Now, remember I said that the Taliban initially were somewhat open to the idea of a reinstatement of the monarchy, right? But his father, I believe, in about 2000 or 1999, had been assassinated in Quetta, where basically Quetta is to Khandaris what Peshawar is to Mashriqwal. Okay,
Yes.
so
All Jalalabatis go to Peshawar and all Kandaris go to Quetta.
exactly. So Karzai's father had been assassinated allegedly by the ISI or the Taliban because he was a nationalist leader. So he'd become opposed to the Taliban. Now Karzai had been flown into Afghanistan. His visa was actually terminated by the Pakistanis in Pakistan, which meant that he couldn't stay there. So the Americans flew him into Afghanistan to start a rebellion in the Taliban's heartlands in Kandahar. And eventually that rebellion, we know it kind of worked. The Taliban collapsed. Gulagha Shirzai also tagged along, who was initially an ally of Karzai, and then they became rivals. And he was sent to Nangarhar. And if anyone's interested, Karzai and Gulagha Shirzai instituted a tribal form of government in Kandahar that was very exploitative, very oppressive. If you want to read about it, you should read our article on it with General Raziq's profile picture as the profile
with a pistol in his hand.
with a pistol in his hand, asking if tribal warfare is brewing in Afghanistan. But the reason I'm talking about Kandahar specifically is because, I mean, maybe I am biased. You know what? We should acknowledge that there is that. But the whole story generally starts and ends in Kandahar. This is where all of the mistakes generally are made.
Yeah.
Not all of the mistakes. A lot of the mistakes are made. This is where the first battles, in a way, happen. The first suicide bombings, the alarm bells start ringing from Kandahar. So in 2000,
and very interesting for you guys. Most people are probably not even aware of it, but a few days ago, the Taliban convened a grand council of their leadership in Kandahar, under the leadership of Hibatullah Akhundzada, and that's where they decided to create this new cabinet that was announced recently. So again, Kandahar is very important historically in the last 20 years, because after 20 years, now in the beginning of September 2021, this Grand Council of Taliban leaders has selected a new cabinet for Afghanistan.
How dare you suggest it wasn't Director General Faiz Hamid who visited Kabul and told Mullah Bradar
Yeah,
they could
yeah.
the
And there
cabinet.
was a shooting at Arg. Like there was like if you listen to these fake news stories, apparently
They
Anas
threw
Haqqani,
tarmuz at each other.
yeah, Anas Haqqani, the guy you interviewed, basically he was shooting with his revolver at Mullah Bradar, and Mullah Bradar was diving and shooting back, bang, bang, bang.
All the while,
Totally ridiculous.
Anas Haqqani was in Paktia, where he's been uploading pictures from.
Yeah, yeah. So in Kandahar, major historical events. But what I wanted to ask you is, after 9/11, obviously, this current government didn't came into existence just out of the blue. We all knew the characters who were involved. Something that maybe we should comment on is this new setup was supposed to be a new government that strives for democracy and alliance with the United States and everything, but nobody really bothered to talk about how Jamiat Islami hosted all these Arab fighters in Afghanistan during the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
How Abdurrab Rasul Sayaf, one of the major characters in the post-2001 setup, was a very close ally of the Arab fighters, Arab Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And for some reason, everybody decided to just ignore that and forget that. And all the blame of foreign fighters and everything was shifted towards Taliban. And yes.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, especially and even now it's the Haqqani network and the Haqqani network alliances with foreign fighters, so on and so forth, ignoring that people like Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani, people like Ustad Sayaf, these guys were very in the 80s, if you heard in the
Yeah.
80s and in the early 90s, if you heard what these guys were saying, these guys
Yeah.
were not anywhere
Yeah,
near.
very interesting point. After the first Gulf War in the early 90s, a lot of these Arab jihadis who were settled in Afghanistan, they were opposed to the idea that the Saudis allow the Arabian Peninsula to be used as a launching pad to attack Iraq. Okay?
Mhm.
Because that means that the Muslim soil, the holy land for Muslims, is used by non-Muslims to attack another Muslim nation, Iraq. Like all these jihadis, they obviously didn't support Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein was a secular nationalist Arab, national socialist, that
Dictator.
is, yeah, a national socialist Arab, just like Bashar al-Assad. So it wasn't that they supported Saddam Hussein, but they were opposed to the idea that Muslim land should be used to go and attack and bomb and kill other Muslims. And during that time, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Abdurrab Rasul Sayaf, while they were in Afghanistan, they basically agreed with the Arabs that the rulers of the Arab nation states, to be more specific, Saudi Arabia, that they are basically committing an act of treason against Muslims
Mhm.
by aligning with the United States against Iraq. Basically, based on that argument, you could say that they were considered as extremists. How could you oppose the Saudi government, the Saudi scholars, because they've issued a fatwa and said that it's okay for the Americans to come and invade Iraq and then go through Kuwaiti and Saudi land. that was something that resulted in a lot of antagonism between these jihadi-minded groups like Hizb Islami, Ittihad Islami, Jamiat Islami, on the one hand supported by the Arab Mujahideen, and on the other hand the Arab nation states. And then only less than a decade later, the United States invades Afghanistan to go after those Arabs and the Taliban, and suddenly these guys have changed their views and opinions, and they no longer think that it's an evil act to allow non-Muslims to invade a Muslim country and go after people and bomb them and kill them. And all of a sudden, all of that didn't matter. So it's something that most people don't even think about now, and they don't even realize how these leaders in Afghanistan basically did a 180 on that issue. They assume that it's all perfectly fine when a non-Muslim nation invades a Muslim nation and then kills its people, because at the end of the day, they benefited from them. They received
maslahat.
Yes, it's maslahat. Yeah, a maslahat expressed in dollars.
But yeah, so basically, that is the story, right, of 2002. The transitional government was formed, Sangar.
Yes. The first transitional government. And who were part of that government?
So, you know what? This is actually a good question because, you know, we spoke about the new Taliban cabinet the other day.
Yes.
And we sort of we analyze, you know, the diversity aspect, inclusivity, and we analyzed the how and the why and the rationales behind why exactly the government or this interim setup was not very inclusive. But now here's the thing. A lot of the criticism of that government, of this interim setup, it's come from people like us, but it's also come from people on on some other sides. Okay. Now, so in 2002, the Minister of Interior was Yunus Qanuni, okay, who was a political aide to Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ministry of Interior, Yunus Qanuni. Ministry of Defense, Qasim Fahim. Marshal Qasim, I mean, he wasn't a marshal back then, but he got it eventually. Marshal Qasim Fahim, who was the senior most lieutenant commander of Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ministry of Foreign Affairs went to Dr. Saib Abdullah, who was also a political aide to Ahmad Shah Massoud. And I believe the NDS, or the National Directorate of Security, went to a guy called Arif Sarwari,
Yes.
or popularly known as Engineer Arif.
Yes.
Now, Sangar, forget being from one ethnicity. These guys, it wasn't, you know, they're all from one ethnicity or whatever, not even one province. This was one district, one valley.
And,
right?
and aside from these ministers, you have something called a muin in Afghanistan. A muin is basically a deputy minister.
Yeah.
How many deputy ministerships were allocated to people from Panjshir?
You know what? I don't actually know the deputy ministerships off the top of my head, but I think these are the core ministries of a state, right? Even in Britain, it's sort of a thing where the prime minister is either, you know, he's been a foreign minister. It's sort of, it's an unwritten kind of protocol. So the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the what's it called?
NDS.
The NDS are all in the hands of people that were close to Ahmad Shah Massoud.
From one district. From one district. Yes.
So now here's the thing. Here's the thing, right? This isn't the same. You know, it's been sort of suggested in the last sort of, we need to, I believe in sort of being consistent and being fair. We all have our own biases, but part of being a mature human being is acknowledging those biases. So you know how we said this isn't an instance of the Taliban going around picking out the Pashtuns amongst their ranks, but rather it's about seniority within their organization, and seniority comes with time, and the people who've now been rewarded were the people that were there in the 90s. So a similar thing applies to Ahmad Shah Massoud's people. Now, obviously, Ahmad Shah Massoud represented a constituency in Afghanistan, but now the rank and the leadership of his organizations were basically all uniformly, like I said, that the senior most people were people, even though he allied with people like Abdul Haq and with Muhaqqiq and with Dostum, in his organization, the top brass were people from Panjshir of the same sort of um, with the same sort of background as him. So these were the core ministries, right? And what's really important to note here is that this started to change in about 2004, right? So initially, Karzai was basically content to be a puppet or a spokesman for Shorai Nizar, for the
Yes.
Council of Supervisors. That is what he was. And if you've read Directorate S, you'll know that Karzai and even the Americans were scared that his Minister of Defense, Marshal Qasim Fahim, who basically controlled all of Kabul's police and army at that stage, Karzai and the Americans were terrified that Fahim was going to have him assassinated, right?
Yes.
So, and Fahim had actually tortured Karzai in the civil war because he thought Karzai was a spy for Hikmatyar. So this is the kind of the very uncertain, right, problematic setup that was instituted in Kabul. In Kandahar, we've already explained, Gul Agha Shirzai is the governor. Abdul Razik fought in Gul Agha Shirzai's militia, right? And he was basically in Srin Boldak, whereas Karzai's brother Ahmed-waleed Karzai was the head of the provincial council. Okay,
And all police chiefs in all districts in Kandahar, but were basically distributed among these people. This
basically
particular group of people.
you know what? I'll actually get to the army and the NDS in a bit.
Yeah.
I'll get to the army and the NDS, the ambassadors that went abroad. Everyone, it was basically a massive patronage network. Now we've
Yes.
got
And just before you move on, what in essentially what this means is that since Shorai Nizar were essentially the victors, thanks to U.S. invasion, they were allowed to pick all the seats they wanted. And now that the United States has left the country, Afghanistan is totally evacuated. There are no foreign forces anymore. The Taliban are the victors. So obviously they will pick up a cabinet consisting of their people. So now we're going full circle from our previous episode and today.
and just if we were there in 2001, I mean, I was 6, I would have said this isn't wise. I'll say the same thing to the Taliban as well. But now here's the thing, right? This so this is sort of these are the underlying dynamics between this new setup. So for the outside world, it look brilliant, right? We've got the naivete of the international community. Look, isn't this brilliant? We've got people of different ethnicities working together, different political backgrounds for the common good of the country.
And
To
Sima
rid the
Samar.
country
Sima Samar.
to Sima Samar, yeah, to rid the country of this terrible, dark, medieval force and to propel it into the 21st century. If only. But now here's the thing. By 2004, we had our first presidential election. Okay. Now Hamid Karzai ran against Yunus Qanuni, his Minister of Interior Affairs, right? Hamid Karzai won. Now, things started to change by that point. Things started to change in the sense that what Hamid Karzai did was he basically had a policy of not allowing the Ministry of Defense and Interior to belong to two ministers of the same ethnicity. Okay? So if a Farsiwan was in Interior, a Pashtun had to be in defense. And if a Pashtun was in defense, a Farsiwan had to be in Interior. Right? So this was Karzai's way of trying to manage the situation. Because now here's the thing, the reality that Karzai is facing here is that any Farsiwan that is powerful or prominent enough to become a minister is probably going to be from Shorai Nizar, right? He's not going to be a Farsiwan from Logar or Ghazni, for example, right? He's
Yes.
probably going to be from either Panjshir or the surrounding districts or Andarab or Parwan or whatever, but he's going to be from Shura Nizar. Now, in 2004, I believe it was General Abdurrahim Wardak became the Minister of Defense. The Minister of Interior saw a couple of changes, and the ministers are too inconsequential, and they're not really successful enough to name individually. Dr. Abdullah remained as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the National Directorate of Security passed into the hands of the current acting president of Afghanistan, Amrullah Saleh. Okay. Now, what happened to Qasim Fahim, right? Who was, the very powerful Minister of Defense? Well, what Karzai did was he basically made Qasim Fahim his vice president. Now, technically, that's a promotion. Reality, however, it isn't, because he's not the Minister of Defense. And the Minister of Defense basically controls the whole army. By the way, in 1992, in the Peshawar Accords, Ahmad Shah Massoud was also made the Minister of Defense. And the reason Hikmatyar, one of the reasons we could say Hikmatyar opposed that, is saying in a country that's broken down, the Minister of Defense is king, right?
Exactly.
So I guess that was how Hikmatyar interpreted it. And when Qasim Fahim was the Minister of Defense in 2002, he basically was the king, right? Now we've got one super chat here. It's 10 euros. It's coming from Nawit Egtree. May Allah reward you, Bruna. Keep up the good work. Brackets, perhaps you can upgrade the podcasts by including a short surah or ayat relevant to the topic. I'm going to offer my thoughts really briefly, Sangar. I'll ask about yours. My personal opinion is that I'm not at all opposed to a surah or an ayat or an ayah from the Quran, but we're not really a religious platform, and we don't want to be seen as that. And we are not really calling to the religion. So by associating religiosity with what we're doing, which is strictly political analysis or history, right, then we'll be doing a disservice to the religion. That is my own personal opinion. What would you say, sir?
And furthermore, I really appreciate the suggestion, but each verse of the Quran has its own tafsir. Now, applying a verse of the Quran to what is called as al-waqi in Islamic terminology, current affairs, requires scholarship. You have to be a mufassir, and you have to be...
Which I am not.
Yeah. So you have to be very, very careful when applying a verse in the Quran, which has its own historic, legal, theological implications, to what is now in current affair. It's a very dangerous game. A lot of people do that. Okay, it's up to them, but it is.
And there's also the thing, like,
I wouldn't do that. Like, it's very dangerous.
Like every now and again, I may use, let's say, bad language, even if it's not explicitly swearing. It's if I say a word like crap, for example, like that. Like, we're not here calling to the religion. It's political science, analysis, history, and if whatever we do will not sort of reach the parameter, sort of the level of sublime religiosity. So we'll only be doing a disservice to the whichever ayah it is. But in any case, Sangar.
Okay, so I want to ask you. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you something else. Okay, so you have been preparing for this podcast, for this live stream, and you told me that you have been reading a couple of books. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I have been reading a couple of books. I've read books on the constitutional arrangements, the negotiations, and whatever that happened in the lead up to, during the Bonn Conference, during the 2002 government, during whatever. But more importantly, I would say I've been reading about how early the insurgency began. Now, if you're in the West, like we are, you know what we hear, Sankar? Man, Afghanistan, aramiwa, it's shaynawu. And then 2006, boom, the Taliban came back, right?
Yeah.
just translate that to let me just translate. I'm sure everyone here watching this, they've sort of heard, Afghanistan. We had it in our pockets. Things were going good, and then we kind of just got into Iraq, which was the bad war. Afghanistan was the good war, and then in 2006, boom, things just exploded in our face, and that isn't really what happened. And that would require, dissertations to write about. But in any case, there's one point I want to make here, right? Even though, so I mentioned that from 2002 to 2004, in 2002, Karzai was just basically a spokesperson for Shura Nizar. Especially, he was terrified of his own Minister of Defense. By 2004, he had just won an election. And we could say whatever we believe about that election, but it was internationally recognized, right? So whether or not the election was a clown festival is irrelevant. If you have the support of the US, the EU, the UN, the UK, all of the neighboring countries, if they've endorsed this election, your bargaining position is much stronger, which is why Karzai was able to basically demote his Minister of Defense. But now here's the thing. At this point, power in Afghanistan is not institutional, okay? Power is not institutional or derived from a government post that was created within 2 years ago, right? So Qasim Fahim was a stakeholder up until his death. But now here's the thing. Despite the fact that there had been a change in the balance of power, right? The damage had been done, okay? Now, why do I say the damage had been done? Do you want to take a guess, Sangar, at how many generals the Ministry of Defense had basically promoted in 2002 alone?
I remember there were like loads and loads of them. Like every Tom, Dick, and Harry was a minister, but I don't know the exact number.
Okay. Well, I remember when I was growing up, there's one thing I would hear saying that the amount of people that have been promoted from Panjshir to generalship, there are more generals now in Afghanistan than there are in the entire EU, or maybe even the Western world.
Yes.
Okay. Now, 2,500 generals were promoted by the Ministry of Defense in 2002 alone. Now, what do you think? Now, there are two questions to pose here. Okay, all of those generals get a salary.
Yes.
Okay,
all of those generals salary.
They get a salary. Yes. They get a general salary. So we have the phenomenon of ghost soldiers in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Where soldiers exist only on paper, and their officers collect the. No. It's beyond that. 2,500 generals were promoted, collecting general salaries. Now, I don't actually have the ethnic, regional, or provincial makeup of them, except one figure, which I read in an article, I believe, from about 2013. Out of the first 100 generals promoted, 90 were from Panjshir. Right? Now, I don't even know what the rest of the 2,400 were, but if out of the first 100, 90 were promoted. So I could say we could make an inference that that was the general direction in which the country was sort of So Karzai inherits this in 2004. Do you see what I'm saying? So even if the damage, the seeds have been sown, right? 2,500 generals, Sangar. I don't even think we've had that much in our history.
The United States doesn't even have 2,500 generals, and they have military bases in 135 countries.
Exactly. Now, here's the thing. This obviously didn't apply just to the conventional army. The NDS, what was then Afghanistan's national intelligence organization, right? In 2012, 70% of the NDS were from Panjshir, right? Now, here's the thing. This isn't just, it's not just a matter of, this is unfair, whatever, but this is bad military strategy, right? Because how the hell can these people secure the whole country? Like I said, it's not just a matter of one ethnicity. One ethnicity perhaps could be more understandable. For example, if it was a preference, I mean, I'm not excusing ethno supremacy here, but let's say, for example, Sangar, right? Um, for example, Sangar, right? You have Farsiwanan from Ghazni, from Urgun, from Khost, from Gardez. It's part of a
From
national
Kabul,
thing
from Kabul.
from Kabul. Then maybe you could say that though they give more of a national flavor
Yeah.
to this new army organization, these guys are only being picked from one valley,
Yeah,
right? Now,
and before we get the regular lazy question, do you have something against Panjshir? Well, uh, these are the facts. Okay, these are the facts, and just like Umar Johnson says, facts. We can't do anything about it. This is
I
what
mean,
people
and
need to
here's
know.
here's the thing. I didn't do this, right? You didn't do this. Qasima Fahim did this,
Yeah,
right? We're just telling you what Qasima Fahim did,
yeah.
right? Engineer Arif and Amrullah Saleh, they did this with the
Listen,
NDS.
listen, listen. Ashraf Ghani became president, okay? As soon as he became president in 2014, he started appointing Pashtuns in every position. Not just any Pashtun, Ghalji. And out of Ghalji, not just any Ghalji, Ahmad-Zi, from his own tribe. From my village, 50 people worked in his presidential palace.
There we go.
Is
There we
that
go.
is that justice? Does that make any sense? Is
No, it does.
no? Before people get all
But now here's the
emotional,
thing. Someone
we
someone is gonna someone is gonna I'm probably gonna
yeah,
get crucified from this. But am I correct in assuming that your relatives are bilingual?
yes,
Am I also correct in assuming that the 2,500 Panshiri generals were probably not bilingual?
yes,
And the
but
70% of
but
NDS,
but but to be fair, a lot of Panjshiris have very very typical Pashtun names. General
yeah,
Bariolai, General
yeah, yeah.
Zmariolai, General Nangiolai. It's
Course.
like-
But the point is that I mean, this isn't excusing what Ashraf Ghani did. It's obviously, we've discussed this sort of approach to governance at length. It stinks. But the fact is that this defies not just notions of fairness. You know what? Fairness in Afghanistan is not something we usually get. Fine. It defies practicality as well. This is the central point I'm making. Okay. So this is essentially what the 2002 to 2004 setup basically looks like. So Karzai inherits this in 2004, and as he goes on, he basically tries to play, let's say, more politics. So, for example, 2010, Amrullah Saleh resigns, right? And I believe Karzai appointed Rahmatullah Nabil to the NDS, right?
yes,
So Karzai tried to maneuver himself around and generally tried to record more Pashtun technocrats, which is obviously a problem. But from his perspective, he was thinking any Tajik that I recruit is going to be from Shura Nizar, right? So I'm going to need to recruit and cultivate my own sort of base and following, right? And this is why, from an ethnicity perspective, this whole project was a total shambles to begin with. And if the Taliban are not careful here, the Taliban, we could say, I don't know, more ethnically diverse than Shura Nizar in 2001. Would you agree with that, Sangar?
um, no, no, no.
But, okay, I'll wait for you to come back.
Sorry. Okay. So with
Would you
regards
say the
to
Taliban are more ethnically diverse as an entire organization than Shura and Nizar were in the in 2001? I would say the
yeah,
Taliban are.
yes, yes, but if you talk about first initial post 2001 government and the people who were as part of Shura Nizar involved in that government,
Mhm.
then I would say yes. That first
I'm talking
government, yeah,
right now,
right now,
2021
yeah,
Taliban.
yeah. So the current Taliban leadership and the rank and file, they're pretty ethnically diverse, like even more than 20 years ago. I would say that right now, because of everything that has happened in northern Afghanistan, all the injustices, all these warlords, all the abuses and everything, that was a very fertile recruiting ground for Taliban. So a lot of people who historically belonged to...
Ashraf Ghani's ethnic politics.
Yes, exactly. That had a very contributing. That was a contributing factor, but the current Taliban movement has managed to attract a lot of Uzbeks, Tajiks, Imaks, Arabs. I mean Afghan Arabs, yeah, because there are many Arabs in northern Afghanistan. People who are originally Arabic by, or they're settlers from centuries ago. So that's a recent development. But what's important is that after 2001, the government was created, okay, and it relied heavily on Western forces, their presence, their financial support, their military support. And because people in Panjshir were so prominently involved in the defense and security sector, they have used their position to collect a lot of weapons and stash them in Panjshir. And now you see all these videos of huge depots being discovered in Panjshir, where they have entire collection of all sorts of ammunition, explosive, assault rifles. All these things are present there. And they just managed to take all of that and then hide it in Panjshir. And in the last 20 years, nobody even bothered to ask what's going on. Where are all these guns? Where are all these weapons? Where is everything?
Some of them are getting lost. Some of them are getting sold to the Taliban, or a lot of them are getting sold to the Taliban.
Regarding that, this reminds me, somewhere around 2010, 2011, there was a big story in Western media. Apparently, 250,000 weapons were given to the Afghan government by the Americans. Some of those weapons were American-made M4, M16 rifles, pistols and everything. Some of them were, I think, Bulgarian and Romanian Kalashnikov models. Anyway, very high quality weapons were given to Afghanistan, and they all disappeared. All of them disappeared. Okay, and back then,
some people must have gotten very rich.
Yes, and all those weapons just vanished. Nobody knew where they were gone, and they wonder why after 20 years the Afghan armed forces were why did they collapse within 10 days when the Taliban started their offensive? How is it possible? Well, in the last 20 years, you gave all these weapons, all these ammunition, all these explosives, all these vehicles to a corrupt government where they would regularly steal and sell those things in the black market or hide them in caves in Panjshir, and nobody was even questioned about it. Nobody even bothered to ask, what did you do with all the guns? Like, I used to work in a factory when I was 22, and we were packing up stuff, and I remember one day, one of our colleagues, he was a Caribbean guy, he would drive around. Caribbean guy.
Let's talk the British standard, okay?
Okay, Caribbean guy, and he accidentally misplaced a pallet of goods in the wrong aisle, and he was almost fired for that. Okay, poor guy was almost fired for that. But in Afghanistan, in the last 20 years, they would just lose 250,000 guns, and nobody would get even questioned, arrested, or prosecuted, nothing. And all of those guns were, by the way, paid for with US tax dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well,
Walid, I want to move
yes.
on and ask you about.
There's another point that I have to make here, right? So I told you that there was sort of an attempt to there was an attempt to sort of basically make the Taliban the moderate Taliban political party, okay, and that was sort of entertained, but you know, generally speaking, most of the Taliban rank and file remained loyal to Mullah Omar. There was a lack of political will. Long story short, it didn't happen. But now here's the thing: the overrepresentation of people with a Shura Nizar background in the army and in intelligence, it started to actually have a bad effect in the south, where most of the troops were deployed. Now, so for example, in 2002, what was going on in Afghanistan looked much less like an occupation than what was going on in, let's say, 2011 or even 2018. So, for example, right, in 2002, Sangar, there were 15,000 international troops. Okay, 15,000. And in 2007, there were 47,000. Okay, 2011, there were 140,000. Okay, 2018, there were roughly about 16,000. But now here's the thing: in what was going on, so in 2004, right? I've made some notes on some paper. In 2004, let's look at the ethnic breakdown of the army. Okay. By the way, Sangar, do you know what NCO means in a
And
military sense? NCO.
no, no, no. Sorry.
Okay, but in any case, we're going to look at the breakdown ethnically of the army in terms of troops and officers. Okay, so in terms of troops, Pashtuns 52.7%. Okay, keep this at the top of your head. Pashtuns 52.7. Okay, let me round it up. Pashtuns 53, Tajiks 37, Hazaras 5, Uzbeks 3, and others 3. Okay, so 53% Pashtuns, 37% Tajiks in terms of troops. Okay, but do you want to hear the officer breakdown?
Yeah.
32% Pashtun, 56% Tajik.
Yeah.
Now,
So the leadership were all Tajik.
exactly. So now here's the thing. There's an obvious reason for that. The guy who was heading the Ministry of Defense, the recruitment, and there's another thing as well here. Do you remember the DDR campaign?
Yes. Yeah.
Disarm something and
Yeah.
reintegrate.
And
Okay.
an interesting story about that. So when I was in Kabul, uh, uh, I borrowed a car from a friend of my father, who has a car dealership, and because he has a car dealership, he would rent his cars to all these Western NGOs, and one of the cars that the DDR used was a green SUV. And
Okay.
when I was in Kabul, they allowed me to drive around in that car. And while I was driving in the car, it had all the signs and everything of DDR. So nobody was stopping me in Kabul. I didn't have even a license. And I would drive around everywhere around the city, and everybody assumed that I belonged to that NGO. And so
But now
that's
here's the thing.
this.
Let's just break down what DDR
Yes.
was to everyone. Basically, there was a campaign of so what we had after 2001 was a series of militias that were controlling the country together with the US. The DDR was basically a campaign to make sure that these militias disarmed and were reintegrated into a new Afghan National Army. Now, the disarming bit was actually controversial because basically the DDR, sorry, the where was I? So it was the disarming bit was
Yes.
controversial because a lot of these militiamen were like, "Why should I disarm?
Yeah.
We are mujahideen. We are being punished for our success."
Yeah.
So here's the way you placate them: you reorganize and reintegrate them into an army,
Yeah.
right, and give them good positions. Now, who
Exactly.
were these militias? Like I said, they were Shura Nizar, right? Now we mentioned that the officership and the general sort of the leadership of the army were predominantly Tajik. Obviously, the Minister of Defense, Qasim Fahim, was running a patronage network via the Ministry of Defense, elevating his own allies and his own kin and clan and whatever. And you obviously had the pre-existing militias from the beginning who were given handsome roles in the army. But now, in and around 2005, when you're in Kandahar, there's a problem, right? Because a lot of these local commanders or officers, it was actually reported that they had bad relations, not just with local people, but even with local police and with their own foot soldiers, because they were refusing to speak Pashto with people.
Yeah.
So if you know anything about Kandahar, you know that Dari is not spoken commonly in Kandahar. So whilst the more cosmopolitan Kandaharian, like myself, may speak Dari, generally speaking, people don't speak it, right?
Yeah.
So as a matter of practicality, you'll need people that will speak Pashto there. You'll need officers that speak Pashto there. But obviously, those officers didn't. And if they did, they actually had. You've got this really weird thing in Afghanistan where someone will know the other language, but be so racist against the other culture or ethnicity that they'll refuse to speak it. You have it with those really big mustached khalqis as well, where they'll speak better Dari than even sort of Masood Khalili, for example, but they'll refuse to speak it and will only answer in Pashto.
Sort of like I know Urdu, but I refuse to speak it. No,
Now,
but this reminds me of something important, guys. We had a Dutch commander who fought in Uruzgan in 2006, 2007, and he was one of our first guests on our podcast. So check out the podcast with Nico North. It's on YouTube and it's all on streaming services. He was our guest, and he talked elaborately about the fact that his translators didn't know any Pashto in Uruzgan. Many Afghan army soldiers and commanders didn't know any Pashto in Uruzgan, but they were all there, supposedly fighting against Taliban, who spoke in a language that they didn't understand.
Exactly, but here's the thing: they had bad relations even with the local police officers. So the local police officers, obviously, probably in 2000 and early 2000s Kandahar, the local police officers probably not going to be literate, okay? Much less know Dari, okay? So these reports that surface where it says these officers are refusing to speak Pashto, right, implies that they knew it and they just weren't speaking it because of some sort of weird vendetta, right? Now, the
Just
point
one
is
second,
that,
just one second. Azad Zoe is asking where you get the statistics from. Can you please give him the reference?
I'll tweet it in a bit because I'm reading off. I read it off a bit of paper.
Okay.
But essentially, so you've got basically an army with a minister of defense at the top, who is who's basically running his own sort of clan network, if we can say that, and composed generally of militiamen who have their own preconceived prejudices and whatever. And that's not a surprise because that was encouraged by their political leadership. Okay. Now, that is basically the story of only about 3 years, right?
Yeah.
But this is we're not going to go into the other 17 years of the Republic, but this is where
the foundation
the foundations were laid over here.
Yeah.
Now, in 2005, and once again, let's talk about Kandahar. In 2005, Karzai came under pressure from the international community to fix his sort of act up, right? To stop relying on these warlords, right? But obviously, some warlords are more equal than other warlords. Okay, so in Kandahar, we had a guy called Mullah Naqib. Now, Mullah Naqib was a Jamiyati. A lot of people listening right now will be shocked. They'll be like, what, a Pashtun Jamiyati?
Yeah.
But up until the mid-90s, Jamiyat was actually very popular in Kandahar, as were Mahaz and as were Jabheh Nijat Milli, right? Hizb Islami and Ittihad Islami did not have much of a following in Kandahar. So Mullah Naqib was actually in charge of Kandahar city and was told to surrender to the Taliban by none other than Burhanuddin Rabbani. Okay?
Interesting.
Because at that point, Rabbani and Masood had allied with the Taliban.
Yes.
And they basically said, go after Hikmatyar and we'll sort the rest out. Okay? So Mullah Naqib basically had a cold relationship with the Taliban. It wasn't, but there are reports that he helped Mullah Omar escape. Okay? Now, in 2005, the international community basically pressed Karzai to drop some of these allies. Now, Mullah Naqib was an Alakoseh, and if you know about the Alakoseh, they're a Durrani tribe based generally or very strongly in Arghandab, which is, if one day Awabras Yaudzaib of Larso, it's a beautiful area. It's known for fruit. It's got a beautiful river. It's very green. But Mullah Naqib and his Alakozi provided the bulk of Kandahar's police force. So when Karzai basically forced Mullah Naqib to step down, the bulk of the police force, who came from what's it called, from the Alakozay tribe, also left the police. You see, and it was from then that the Taliban in 2005 started to be reported to be encroaching in and around Arghandab. Okay, in Helmand, you had Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh, who was the local strongman. I believe he was deposed in 2006, but he still retained his own private militia. So he was the governor of Helmand. He was ousted, but even after being the governor of Helmand, after his firing or dismissal, he kept his private militia. Now, remember what I said about power is not institutional here, it's personal, and it depends on money and patronage networks. So Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh, I believe, was an Alizé, right? And prior to the Taliban takeover, the Alizi in and around Helmand were very predominant. The Taliban, with their takeover, they exiled a load of these warlords. So after 2001, what Sher Mohammad and his allies used to do was to tax unilaterally, arbitrarily, the Ishaq-Z tribes. Okay? Now, if you know about Mullah Sadr Ibrahim, I believe,
Yeah,
Ishaq-Z, right? I believe, if I'm not correct, because the Taliban, because the Americans tried to divide them along political lines, sorry,
yeah,
tribal lines,
yeah,
they're now very vigilant about giving away their tribal identity. But
yeah,
now so this is the thing, and Sher Mohammad Akhundzadeh was also very deeply involved in the opium trade. I believe there was an instance where sort of international officials visited the governor's compound. Helmand's governor's compound was visited by international officials. They saw heaps of opium there, and his excuse was, we're, we're gonna we just collected this here.
they're going
We're
to
burning
burn
it.
it. Yeah, they're going to
We're
burn it
burning it.
on a
We're
pipe.
burning it. Okay, so okay, so this is the reality here. But now, obviously, when the international community in the 1980s, opium started to be seen as a source of quick, easy revenue for the Afghan Mujahideen, and this was actually facilitated and helped by the ISI. There's even some evidence to suggest that the ISI also made a fair share of money from opium. Now, here's the thing, Sangar. In 2000, because the by this stage, because of the Soviet destruction and whatever that's been inflicted, much of the South is very reliant on opium. In 2000, Mullah Omar banned opium, the cultivation of opium, right? And that was what actually led to the southern farmers getting really annoyed and refusing to defend Kandahar from the Americans because we're going hungry. How could you do that to us? So when the internationals started to put pressure on Karzai that there's an opium problem in Helmand and in Kandahar, when they started to basically launch these eradication efforts, both Ishaq-Z, Ali-Z, everyone went against the internationals and the foreign occupation. There were, I think, British officials even reported that when we're walking in the bazaar, pro-Taliban tapes, nasheeds, and taranas are being sold openly, right? In areas like Zabul, in areas like Helmand, even the Afghan government were telling the internationals the population are against us, right? So this is basically the reality. Even the guy, I believe he was Do you remember General Dawood?
Yes, yes. He
Man
was
of action.
yeah, he is said to be also very deeply involved in drug
This guy
trade.
was the head of the counter narcotics
Yeah,
agency of the government.
yeah.
Okay, so for everyone listening here, General Dawood, who was also, I believe, close with
He
Ahmad Shah
he was
Massoud.
from
Yeah,
Takhar, I think. I think he was
he was
from
from
Takhar.
Takhar, and
Yeah.
I believe he was assassinated in 2011 in Badakhshan.
Yes.
Okay, so General Dawood, who was sort of seen as a man of action, a man of principle, so on and so forth, head of the counter narcotics mission, he was involved in in
Yeah.
narcotics trafficking. So the point is that
And
this is essentially
according to speculations, that was also the reason why he was killed. Yeah.
potentially. I wouldn't be surprised, but now that this is essentially the reality of what's going on in Herat, for example. Ismail Khan had basically made it his personal mission to exclude any and every Pashtun from government, and Pashtun communities faced a lot of repression, right? So, excuse me, that obviously invited central government and American intervention because they feared. Wait, excuse me. Um, they feared sort of a Taliban encroachment into the area, and there was a Taliban encroachment into the area. I believe it was in Ghorian where the Taliban first started to make sort of inroads and encroachments. So this is the thing. Now on the Taliban side, right, in 2002, um, contrary to, oh my God, 2006 happened and bang, these guys came out of nowhere, right? Contrary to that, in 2002, Mullah Obaidullah had actually, the Taliban the Taliban defense minister. So Mullah Obaidullah died in Pakistani imprisonment. Okay. Now, in 2001, Mullah Obaidullah was the defense minister. Do you know who his deputy was?
No.
Mullah Bradar. Now we
Uh-huh.
know Mullah Bradar is a senior official, so it just goes to show you what level of leadership Mullah Obaidullah was at. Mullah Bradar was his deputy. Okay, Mullah Obaidullah issued a call to arms, and it was in and around Balochistan, Waziristan, what was then the Northwest Frontier Province, that the Taliban started the recruitment drive. Okay, young
Yeah,
men.
this is something very interesting because after 2001, uh, basically, this is something that is often now claimed. You see all these Western journalists and everybody saying, but according to WikiLeaks and according to this and that, the Taliban, they all wanted to surrender and give up and they didn't want to fight. But the Americans, they wanted the war to continue. And that doesn't make sense because if we know the role of Mullah Obaidullah, if we know the strategy of the Taliban back then, what they did is okay, so we cannot hold cities, we cannot hold territory, so it's useless to fight in the cities and allow the whole city to be destroyed. Just fall back, regroup, and come back. That was the strategy.
I mean, I would say in 2001/2002, they were still thinking, because like I said, back then it wasn't, first of all, when you're in a position of power, when you make bolder demands, right?
Yes.
Back then they were, it was 15,000 troops. Okay, not ideal, but we'll join with you, right? You guys will leave and the country, like, we don't mind power sharing kind of thing. When they realized that wasn't going to happen, they didn't just lie around for 4 years and then start suicide bombing the hell out of the country. It doesn't work like that. But so in 2002, they've started to go around both Pakistani Pashtuns, right, and Afghan refugee camps, even going as far as Karachi, right, to launch a recruitment drive. Now, in this sense, the Taliban are the real Pashtun nationalists because they don't see the Durand line and which side of it you're born on as being sort of something to be frowned upon. If
Much
you're a
to
Waziri,
PTM's
if
chagrin.
you're much to PTM's fury, if you the Taliban, this is where we turn the coin on its head, right? The Taliban, if you are I don't know Masid, right, with no sort of meaningful connection to Afghanistan in the family sense, we don't mind. Come along, right? Fight with us, right? And they did this. They did this, by the way, in the late 90s as well. Hakimullah Massoud, Baytullah Massoud, they fought in
Nick
Afghanistan.
Mohammed
They fought
Wazir.
Nick Mohammed Wazir. So this isn't anything new on behalf of the Taliban, right? So the Taliban start to launch this recruitment drive. Now, here's the thing. Would you agree with me, Sangar, that we've established that this government was very shaky from the beginning?
I think we have established that in the
We've
first
established that. Okay.
25
So
minutes.
we know that the Taliban, if they wanted to basically go around rural areas in groups of, I don't know, 25, 50, whatever, they wouldn't face that much opposition because there weren't that many international troops. There weren't that many Afghan troops, the Afghan government, even up until its dying days, never had much of a presence in rural areas, right? So this is what the Taliban did. Now, generally, their strategy is very difficult to sort of uh, explain in a go. And this goes to theories of guerrilla warfare. And I was speaking to someone who studies in King's College, my former university, war studies, right? We were speaking about Mao versus Che Guevara's theories of war. So Mao is basically you need to be based in the country, you need to have a constituency, slowly you build, right? Che Guevara's is acts of terrorism in the city centers, cause like a big sort of a stir, and then people slowly will start to notice you and they'll join along. Now the Taliban kind of did both, right?
Yes,
It's
and
really
and and
it's
you know
really
what's really
difficult.
disturbing? What's
Yeah,
really disturbing? Around
yeah,
2007, I was talking to this Afghan who basically his father used to live in Peshawar, okay, and his father was very closely linked to the Taliban. And this
mhm,
Afghan, he told me that basically these Taliban commanders and etc. They have apparently studied a lot of theory, including Mao, Che, and these things. So it's
so
not it's
you
it's
know,
not something
contrary
that came out of
contrary
the
to
blue. Yeah.
exactly contrary to the commonly held belief, because we were in a Twitter space yesterday with Charlotte Bellis and Al
Yes.
Jazeera English, and she was like, you know, these like nameless, faceless Taliban just suddenly came to everyone's screens, and obviously nameless, faceless, brutal, barbaric, stupid, tribal, troglodytes, whatever. But actually, the violence, the massive amounts of
Yeah.
violence, and this isn't a compliment, this is just a reality. The amount of violence that they used in achieving their political aims was very strategic, it was very calculated. They didn't behead civilian workers because they were angry. They beheaded them to strike fear and terror into the population. And, you know, if
But but uh,
I
but
I have
yeah.
relatives, for example, I'm not going to mention names, that were just electricians for the
Yeah.
Americans, like contractors in a
Yeah.
sense, working for different people. Numerous night letters stamped outside his house. We will kill you,
Yeah.
right? Just an electrician, civil workers,
Yeah.
whatever. Now, so the point is that the Taliban's insurgency, whilst they use the ideas of Che and Mao, they didn't rigidly stick to one or the two of them. They kind of tailored it to local circumstances. The Taliban and both Ahmad Shah Massoud would, I mean, his supporters would kill me for saying this, but maybe this is something in which they are similar. Because Ahmad Shah Massoud was also known to read the books of Mao very
Yeah.
avidly, right? So so the Taliban have started to issue recruitment drives non-stop, right? And initially, for example, in the south, the first suicide attacks didn't really go well, right? They didn't really achieve much. But then suicide attacks as well started to become more systematized. Okay, there was a minimum age that was basically set for the suicide attackers, and this is sort of the part of the conversation that's the more disturbing, the more saddening, right? Because we think about how many boys, right, quite literal boys, basically became suicide attackers, and we even see now in Panjshir, boys are being given weapons to fight. But you know, 14-year-old suicide attackers. That was something that was really developed and fine-tuned in Waziristan, right? The Taliban there basically made that their thing. There were from the 1980s. There were a series of from the 1970s. There were a series of madaris that were occupied by, instituted by Maulawi Jalaluddin Haqqani, right? And those madaris, the infrastructure was already there, right? You just had to adjust your approach to them. Now, suicide attacks is obviously not something I don't think even anyone can like them, but I would say from speaking to different people on different sides of the religious divide that it's a very hotly contested topic, but it's a contested topic. That
And
so
and most
the
people in Afghanistan were against that idea. Even
yeah
many senior Taliban leaders were against the idea. And this is also something to bear in mind: is that in Islamic law, uh, when new concepts and new ideas are introduced, okay, something that didn't exist in the past, then you will all have very divergent views on that issue. But
yeah
as time goes by, an idea becomes more and more acceptable. You will see that much more people will start accepting that as something that is legitimate, and that's
the son
exactly,
of the current Amir, the son of the current Amir died in a suicide attack.
yeah.
He you know, it was, he didn't die in battle, he died in a suicide attack. So
This was in
even though it was
2017.
2017, he
Yeah,
attacked, I believe, Americans in Helmand, right?
yeah,
So it shows you that even if it was and it remains controversial as time has gone on, basically the argument of we need to fight them in whichever way we can has started to outweigh the other side, right? So a lot of these suicide attackers, we know, were not actually, I mean, ethnically they were Afghan, but they weren't Afghan citizens.
yeah.
There were loads
They
of
were
Pakistani
there were
Pashtuns amongst these guys.
Waziristanis. There were a lot from Waziristan. There were many from Moman, Bajawar, Warakzai, all these tribal areas in Pakistan. And what's so shocking about this whole development is that you would see uh, large number of people who would enlist as a suicide bomber. And those lists, even until today, there are still thousands of people who have registered, I want to do this. But
Mhm.
there are more people willing to do that than they
Than the
actually,
demand, than
than
the
the
actual
demand.
demand.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
supply far outweighs the demand. Let's take a quick pause, Sangar. Can I ask everyone watching, right, to like the video and share the link, please?
Yes. Abdul Hadi asks, what about Dasht Laili?
Yeah, Dash Layli was, you know, it's something that we've discussed on our platform before. It was basically a massacre of Taliban prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Mullah Fazil Mazlum Yar, who we also spoke about the other night, who's the current deputy minister of the Taliban, he and Nurullah Nuri surrendered to Dostum. And how much does that have to do with the madrasas and education in them? W. Momandi, it does have to do with the education in the madrasas. You have to understand that those madrasas, like I said, they were established in the 80s, right? In the 70s and in the 80s. Those madrasas also churned out thousands of mujahideen during the Soviet jihad. If you have friends from KPK, they'll tell you that in their villages, you know, dozens of men were mujahideen fighting against the Russians. So those I think Maulawi Jalaluddin Haqqani had a madrasa in near Miran Shah,
Yes.
Manba'ul Ulum,
Manbal Ulum,
uh,
yeah.
so the
Very
fountainhead of
prominent.
knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But
what
with
obviously
regards to
with
the
that sort of
madrasas, regard to
yeah
madrasas, so let's just explain how that exactly happened. Okay, so uh, the madrasas along the tribal belt and you know, near the Durand line. The conspiracy theory is that all these madrasas were created by CIA and ISI, but if you know the region, if you know the people in Afghanistan, these Mujahideen leaders and everything, you would know,
and the people in the tribal areas.
yeah, well, you would know that the circumstances, the political circumstances in Afghanistan, and the nature of these groups, such as Hizb Islami, Jamiat Islami, etc., has resulted in them establishing themselves in Pakistan. And because these groups were often led by religious scholars, they had easier access to religious networks in those areas. And when thousands and thousands of Afghan refugees would flee into Pakistan, what do you expect that they will create? A school of engineering, a school
Gender
of
studies.
nursing, gender studies. So obviously that's what they're going to do. They are religious scholars. They're going to create a school for Afghan refugees. So what kind of school are they going to create? And that's the logical thing. And so those schools popped up as mushrooms, and it wasn't part of a big conspiracy. Those were the circumstances. If you have few elements, the leadership of these mujahideen groups were a lot of them were religious scholars, and they fled to those countries, to those areas. They established themselves. They created a network with Jamiat Ulama Pakistan and all other Islamic parties in Pakistan,
And the
Jamaat
ISI.
Islami, and the ISI,
The
obviously.
ISI.
And what's very important, and this is something a lot of people don't know, around Peshawar there are hundreds of madrasas of Badakhshanis
Yeah.
and Uzbeks. Okay? Uzbeks and Badakhshanis around Peshawar in those areas. And those madrasas, those students, most of them, those madrasas weren't established for Hizb Islami or the Taliban. They were created in the 80s by Jamiat Islami, by those parties. And after years of war, things have changed. The ideologies, the political beliefs and political alignments of these institutions has changed. So a lot of those madrasas have produced a lot of Taliban who have been involved in Badakhshan, Takhar, Faryab, Badghis, northern provinces of Afghanistan. So you see, the idea of suicide bombing, as we discussed before, first, the idea of suicide bombing didn't exist in Afghanistan, okay? Nobody believed that that's a good way of waging war. First, the idea of suicide bombing came from Middle East. Palestinian, secular nationalist Palestinians in the 60s and 70s, they developed this idea. Okay? Then it was adopted by Hezbollah, a Shiite group in Lebanon. And then Al-Qaeda was...
Hamas.
Hamas...
And I believe Yusuf al-Qaradawi basically has given them the green light to do that.
Yeah, so basically Hezbollah and Hamas, Hezbollah are Shiites, pro-Iranians, and the Iranians also used similar concept during the Iraq-Iran war. They would send
human wave attacks.
Yeah, they would send young boys into a minefield, okay? And those boys would run on the minefield and then make sure that they can detonate as many landmines as possible. So these concepts existed in Middle East, Hezbollah, Iran. They have basically popularized the idea, but Al-Qaeda didn't really exist as an entity as such, but it emerged later on, and Al-Qaeda adopted many different ideas from different sides of the world, from different groups, including from secular Arab nationalists, from Shiite groups such as Hezbollah, and
you're forgetting one group as well, the Tamil Tigers.
Tamil Tigers, they would do that as well. So you see, this concept existed, and then it was popularized, and it became a novel idea in Afghanistan. Around 2004, we started seeing that it has basically been adopted by the Taliban. And once it was adopted by the Taliban, and there were a lot of debates between scholars like Maulawi Hassan Jan, very, very prominent Hanafi scholar from Peshawar. He was against suicide bombings, and they even say that that's actually the reason that he was assassinated, because he was so influential and he was against it, so he was killed. If that's true, I don't know, but that's what people say. But there were very serious political debates about this act of blowing yourself up. But at the end of the day, most groups along the tribal area, all these madrasas, they adopted this concept that it's legitimate, okay? That it's valid and legitimate. And now you have, after 20 years, like the entire Taliban movement is convinced that this is a legitimate way to wage war.
Just about, I know it sounds insane, just about a month ago, they suicide bombed trying to kill General Bismillah Mohammadi and Ahmed Massoud. Do you remember that suicide attack in Kabul?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's very interesting, because now they are fighting terrorism against, in Afghanistan against Daesh, who do suicide bombings. But just a month ago, the Taliban were doing it as well.
Sangarza, I'll be back in literally 2 minutes, yeah?
Okay. Guys, until he's back, I would like to ask you guys to pose your questions now. So I see a lot of questions here. Madrasa Akura attack by Maulana Samiul Haq. Yeah, it's Atok and not Khatak. The Khatak tribe does live there, but it's called Atok. Maulana Samiul Haq was assassinated in mysterious circumstances as a ghost settler for General Razik murder. I have no idea. I have no idea if that's true. Wagma Momandi says, but back into the madrasas, if we can, the argument that USID from 1996 to 1992 underwrote the printing of explicitly violent Islamist textbook. You see, Wagma, the thing is with printing those books is, okay, how many of those books were printed? And we have Darul Uloom Deoband, the most influential institution in the entire subcontinent. We have Dars Nizami. We have Fiqh Hanafi, which consists of many textbooks that are used in many issues. In Fiqh Hanafi, you have Quduri and all these books. None of these books, none of these issues were produced by USID. The role of some booklets created by USID is being overblown. If you try to understand what they exactly teach in madrasas, which books they teach, where those books originate from, who the authors of those books are, you will realize that most of the material existed there for hundreds of years, okay? So it's not like these ideas, all of them, they were introduced only in the 1980s by USID and CIA, etc. This is the problem with Western narrative and the Western way of trying to explain what has happened in Afghanistan. That's why we have to go a few steps deeper. We have to go beyond just what is being said in the media and in Western publications. I have actually studied with some of the guys, from those madrasas from Peshawar. My teacher was someone who studied there 16 years. And I used to live with a few Afghans who grew up in refugee camps in Peshawar. And they studied in those madrasas. I spent like 2 years with those guys, and we talked extensively about their education, what they studied, and everything. And then you will find out that this whole notion that there are a few booklets printed by publishers who received money from the Americans, their role is really negligible to the entire system of madrasas where all these hundreds of thousands of Afghans studied. But it's a popular idea that is often discussed in Western media among many anti-war groups, especially these anti-imperialist type leftist groups. They're saying, yes, Afghanistan was a very peaceful country. There was no jihadism, but these Americans, they came and they published a few books, and then suddenly everyone became radicalized. That's a very lazy explanation of what has happened, and that's why I think it's important to go one step deeper and try to understand how influential local ideas and concepts were with regards to religiosity, jihad, etc., etc. And I think that this is something that we should also write about in future. We've discussed this in January of this year in all the topics that we were going to discuss this year, but inshallah we will definitely.
I mean, to be fair, to be fair to us, I think the last month and a half we've just had to drop plans and be improvisational and just sort of provide an alternative sort of counter narrative in terms of how quickly things moved in Afghanistan. We did warn that this sort of thing would happen. It just happened a lot quicker than we even expected. But in any case, as Gorgosh once said, man amadam.
Okay.
So
Okay, so
so
trick Afid 2 says, just want to verify that I also have Ahmadzai family, and a bunch of my Ahmadzai relatives from California left to Afghanistan to serve government with no credentials. Thank you, which exactly proves my point. Okay.
okay. So fair enough. But so where were we, Sangar? We were talking about the Taliban and suicide attacks and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And now
So
here's the thing.
yes, please.
Without with so we were talking about Mao and Che. Okay. So Mao's is basically built up in the country. The guerrilla, I believe that Mao said the following: the guerrilla must move in the country the way fish moves in water, sort of
Exactly.
fish moves in a stream,
Yeah.
right? So basically, the gorilla has to be just completely, totally just blend into the country. You know that he has to be of the country, and the country has to be of him. Now, Shay, obviously, we could say is more of a terrorist,
Yeah.
according to the and
But
I hate using that word
yeah.
because it's so meaningless now. But you see what I'm saying?
But Che was a follower of Mao.
It's
He
just
was a
updated.
Maoist communist, but he
Yeah.
came with a more novel version of Maoism.
Exactly. But now here's the thing, right? So if we look at the Taliban, we kind of see that they've done both. But in terms of so here's the question, right? How did the Taliban gain so much control over so much territory? Well, here's the thing. In large parts of Afghanistan, we've established that the government presence in rural areas is weak. And Afghanistan is a pre-modern society in the sense that the bulk of the population is not urbanized, like let's say the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the US. Most of the population live in the rural countryside. And in the rural countryside, the government as well as international forces have a weak presence. Where they do have a presence, they're generally just confined to their compounds, or they launch a couple of raids, or they patrol, right? Now, when the government tries to assert its authority in the rural areas, first thing that it does is, civil workers start to go to provide services to the people. Now, here's the thing: the Taliban would kill those civil workers.
Yes.
Okay, so the Taliban would kill civil workers. Like I said, I had a relative who was an electrician, right? Numerous death threats. Alhamdulillah ta'ala, he is alive, right? But the point behind this was to basically paralyze and basically terrify the local population to desist from working with the occupation and its stooges, as the Taliban would say. And it would also paralyze the function of government in those areas, right? So when the government is not present, who is, right? Who's present in the absence of the government, Sangar?
Well, obviously the Taliban, And
Exactly.
one more a point, like the Yaghi groups. Okay, so the Yaghi groups in Afghanistan are like the renegades, the bandits who are not part of the society. They're basically local criminal gangs, and they live in the mountains, in the hills, and those groups operate along all the rural areas in Afghanistan. They're not as prominent and significant as the Taliban or the government, but they are a very important element in this destabilizing regions in Afghanistan. And obviously, the Taliban were the most organized, well-structured entity in rural areas. I wanted to play a little audio of girls singing, celebrating the Taliban victory. And the song they're singing, the lyrics is very much related to the topic that you're discussing about the Maoist way of fighting guerrilla warfare. And everybody is now thinking, what the hell are these guys talking about? But bear with me. It will make sense to you in a second, okay? So here we go. Waleed, did you hear that song that I shared today on Twitter?
I haven't been on Twitter much today, to be honest.
Okay, so I have to be on Twitter. Okay, so listen. When you can listen, just try to translate the first verses, okay?
Something about Nare, but that's about it.
Translated. They're singing Mung Mata Kra Nare. We have defeated the world. Walas Mung Sara Nima Kra. The people, they shared with us Mare, their food. They gave us half of their food. Mung Mata Kra Nare. So that's basically what you're explaining, that when Mao says that you have to be like fish in the water among the people, the insurgency was fed and housed by the people.
In some cases, they stole food from people as well.
Yes, yes, and in this song, these girls, if you listen to the entire song, they also say that we've hidden them in our homes. We gave them shelter. So basically, this describes how the Taliban would be sheltered by rural people. Rural people would give them food, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not, and that's how they sustained the insurgency for 20 years. I know this one guy from the Netherlands. He was very enthusiastic about joining the Taliban, and he left from the Netherlands and he joined the Taliban, and then his parents were all worried because they thought that he was radicalized by people. So the only friend he had on Facebook who had a long beard, it was me. So his parents contacted me and said, well, our son doesn't respond back and he's in Afghanistan. Do you know what's going on? And I was like, how do I know? Well, you are the only friend he has who has a beard. And I said, well, that's no wonder your son ran away and you have no idea what happened. If you are so away from and so out of touch so basically this guy, he went to Afghanistan, he tried to join Taliban, and then he spent there a couple of weeks, and then he came back to the Netherlands and he said, these Taliban are horrible people. And I said, why? He said, When I joined them, we were in the mountains and they said, okay, now we're going to steal some chickens. And they went into a village and they stole chickens from local villagers. And that's how they would feed themselves. So I said, yeah, it was your idea to go and join them. What can I say? He said, oh, that's terrible. But basically, the entire 20 years of insurgency was sustained in that way. They didn't have huge donors. They didn't have billionaire supporters like in the 1980s. You had Saudi Arabia was donating billions of dollars to all these groups like Hizb Islami, Jamiat Islami, etc. The CIA gave them loads of money, and individual Arab billionaires, millionaires, they would give them money. And all of that didn't happen in the 90s, after 2001. There were no big donors. So the insurgency had to sustain itself in a very organic way, in a very Maoist guerrilla warfare way of, yeah.
But yeah, that's basically so that was one thing that they did. Basically kill civilian workers. That was how they, in some cases, locals would be receptive to them, shelter them in their homes, basically go to the end extent to sacrifice themselves for the cause. In other case, they had to bully, oppress, beat up, steal from locals. But there was another thing that they would do, is they'd also assassinate imams that were opposed to them. And that was something that they did in Zabul, Helmand. And then at one point, I believe, all of the pro-government mullahs were basically holed up in Kandahar city. And then those mullahs were either so important for the government that they had their own bodyguards, but essentially the assassination of imams, of civilian workers. This is basically what they did in order to basically scare the population and to basically control the narrative. And by, like I said, by 2006, by 2007, large chunks of the South were basically pro-Taliban. They believed in the cause. That was due to a variety of different reasons. That was due to night raids. That was due to night raids. That was due to civilian aerial bombardments on civilian homes. It was due to drug eradication efforts. And even in how we're talking about the Taliban are now more liberal. They're not beating people up for not having beards. That actually happened as early as about 2006, 2007 in Musaqala. I remember journalists were telling Taliban were telling journalists that they're not going to be so harsh this time around, and they're going to be easier on people. And they weren't forcing people to keep their beards, or they were not sort of beating them up for watching movies, and so on and so forth. But this is the thing: it's that the counter-insurgency thing, right? It was a total failure. Okay, and that was because, for example, with the night raids, the violation of privacy, women's dignity, as it's seen, that didn't work. And like a typical raid on a village would go as follows, right? You'd storm into a village rapidly, occupy it, round up the men. Yes, Mr. Morris, Mullah Dadullah was the most harsh of all of the Taliban commanders. That is certainly true.
The one that was very well known around the world because of his videos, but there were others, minor figures, who did even worse things than Mullah Dadullah, but
Mullah
they were not
Dadullah was
as,
just the most well known.
Yeah.
Because Mullah Dadullah was the only one, I believe, that also used to issue threats to the world.
He made the beheading video. Like because of him, there was such a controversy that even within the Taliban, it was a huge problem because of that video.
In the 90s as well, Mullah Omar basically dismissed him of his duties, but he was actually accepted into the Rahbari Shura in 2004. But he was, for all intents and purposes, a military commander. a very good military commander, it has to be said, based on his track record. He was the one that was basically fighting Ahmad Shah Massoud and succeeded to a large extent in pushing him out. But obviously, with
His methods were
unfortunately
really,
his
really
his
terrible,
met and
terrible.
he was the only Taliban commander that used to actually threaten the world. He'd say, "Tsenga chitasi des muj shizi ya awladuna
Mm,
jarawi muj badastasi shizi ya awladuna bam
yeah,
jarawu."
yeah.
Right? But in any
Mm,
case, these guys, when they would go rapidly occupy a village, storm it, round up the men, arrest a few, interrogate them, and then, give them some soap and toothbrushes and some food or some tissues, basically, with a hearts and minds approach. But the hearts and minds approach didn't work because, first of all, the primary concern of people is security, right? And if they don't have security, and if you're the one that are endangering their security, then why the hell would you care? Would they care if you give them soap bars? And secondly, uh, it was actually very common that after a night raid on a village, the Taliban would show up very soon afterwards, right? Um, and basically destroy any of the propaganda materials or the goods that had been provided by the international community, right? And that was their way, and not the most moral or ethical thing to do, but that was their way of basically driving as much of a divide as possible between the local population and the government or the regime or its international backers. Haris Massoud is saying, no wonder Mullah Dadullah spent time in Waziristan. Well, he spent time in Waziristan because he was mediating between different TTP factions as well as between the TTP and the army. He was a very influential commander, very respected as well, despite the brutality that came with him. But the reason he was in Waziristan a lot of the time was to mediate. And that was why even Mullah Omar couldn't really ignore him, because he carried a lot of influence himself. And that's why when he was killed in Helmand in 2007, it was, Asadullah Khalid paraded him around the city, paraded his dead body around the city to basically. Dadullah was a big fish for the government to catch, essentially. So, and then there's another thing here, right, Sangar? There's something called, you know, a lot of these Pakistani trolls on Twitter, they always talk about, brother, this is 5G warfare, fifth generation warfare, right? And fifth generation warfare, we kind of understand in the sense of uh, information, misinformation, psychological operations. The Taliban's, we could say, classical insurgency, fourth generation warfare, in which the Taliban never defeated the Americans in a single engagement in militarily, and they knew that, right? Which is why they
Well,
adjusted a
they
lot.
claim that they defeated them in Shahikot, in Shuak
Yes,
district of
in
Paktia.
in Shaikot, but that is more. Maiwand Ahmedzai wasn't Dadullah was a Kakar, yes. But in any case,
Wait a minute, all these very notorious Taliban commanders who did terrible things were all from your tribe.
yeah, sorry. I
Yeah,
mean, I don't even know what to. Yeah, I
yeah.
guess I'll wait for an Ahmadzai guy to come. Actually, that I shouldn't say that because there were the two most. I don't even know what to say about Ahmadzai first.
You
But
better not
no,
say anything, man.
yeah, I'm not gonna say anything. No,
Okay.
but I have a feeling that like there are non-Pashtuns sort of watching here, and basically thinking, "Oh my God, these guys are about to have a tribal fight." But no, it's not like that. It's that is just the way it is. We have certain. Uh, Wait, let me wait for Sangar to come back. Sangar, the way you just left, it felt like you got upset about the Ahmedzai thing. But I was saying, I have a feeling that there are like non-Pashtuns watching this that think we're just gonna get up now and start fighting each other over sort of tribal
No, if
gigs
there
that
is
we've.
ever going to be a tribal warfare involving anyone from Afghan, it would be me against Kilakam.
But yeah, so
Yes.
so. But in any case, where were we? So yeah, this is fourth generation warfare. Fourth generation warfare. Shaikot is rumored to be loads of Al Qaeda fighters, so it can't really be said. That whether or not it was the Taliban victory is disputed, but the fact that the Taliban started to attack civilian centers, right? Now, the Taliban have always maintained, right, that we have never intentionally attacked civilians. And this is the thing. You could say that they haven't, right? But now there are two things to factor in here. First of all, is the location of these ministries. In the like that these ministries were very poorly garrisoned, oftentimes situated in very busy areas. So when the Taliban would attack these ministries, even if they weren't intending on attacking civilians, civilians would die. Second of all, the fact of that the Taliban, did such high profile attacks, it was for a reason. And specifically, the Haqqanis are notorious for this. And if you guys read my interview with Anas Haqqani, he basically said, look, any attack for which Zabiullah Mujahid has claimed responsibility is not my family doing it. It's Islami Imarat doing it, right? And if we were involved, we were just the soldiers involved in it, right? But the fact of the matter is that these high scale attacks and the massive media coverage they generated, that was very intentional, right? It was designed very specifically to show, like, let's think of it, Sengar. When the Taliban went into that high-rise building and started shooting rocket launchers from the rooftop
My father
on
was
embassies.
underneath that building.
Okay, what benefit military did that serve? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They
No,
basically
because they couldn't destroy the American embassy with
exactly
RPG.
exactly.
Yes, it was.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. That served absolutely no military benefit. They basically sent those guys on a suicide mission, and they're not obviously above using suicide bombers. So why did they do it? They did it because of the coverage. They did it because it would cause a media storm, and it would lead to questions with regard to the wisdom of this war. They attacked the German embassy. I remember when they attacked the Indian embassy. That was bad, right?
Yeah,
And
40
obviously,
civilians died. 40.
I remember and it's basically been established that the ISI were involved in that, right? Now, this obviously comes back to the issue of to what extent were the ISI controlling the Taliban? And I would say that it wasn't really control, but in many instances, the interests of the ISI and the interests of the Taliban converged, right? And that gained a reputation for the Taliban. So you see that in terms of strategy, they're targeting rural area, they're targeting urban centers, inflicting mass casualties on military personnel, foreign personnel. In my article on Anas Haqqani, I spoke about how Badruddin basically on the phone was directing his fighters on where and how to walk around an Intercontinental Hotel Kabul and where to shoot, right? Because they collected enough intelligence to know the general map and the outline of the hotel. You see what I'm
You
saying?
know what's really disturbing about that attack is
Yeah.
that when I was a child, I visited Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul, and around the hotel, you have all these pine trees, okay? And it's like a hill and park. And there was a picture, it was circulating around that time on social media of these Taliban guys who were basically taking pictures of the building. So they were going around the building and
Yeah.
they were basically monitoring the building. But here's the thing, what I don't understand is how did they know in which room on the top floor there are people from, like,
Forget that. How did they get through the checkpoints?
yeah.
They'd basically put their own agents at the checkpoints.
Yeah, I know
Because
that,
they
yeah.
transported all of these weapons, like these men and these fighters, and you don't just get into Intercontinental, right?
Yes.
So they obviously had a very sophisticated in relative terms
And
intelligence and
yeah,
counterintelligence network
and I
to
have
be able to go in.
yeah, and I have an explanation for that. we go back to what we discussed in the beginning of the live stream, how this government after 2001 was created. Basically, it was thoroughly corrupt and everybody was for sale. Okay, you could buy anybody in any level of government. Everybody had a price, even if it means that you want to carry out a suicide attack, killing a lot of people. There were people who were for sale. Something maybe slightly unrelated, but around 2012, there was an article about the price of the AK-74. Okay, because the AK-74 uses a different bullet than the AKM and AK-47. It uses a smaller bullet, and often in Afghanistan, before the American weapons became really popular, people would rely on the AK-74 for sharpshooting. And what happened around that time is that loads and loads of those AK-74s were being imported from Tajikistan and those countries by those Tums militias, and they would sell it to the Taliban.
Yeah,
If you want to know how the insurgency succeeded, if you want to know how they carried out these elaborate attacks in Kabul, it wasn't just something that you see in a movie. No, everybody had a price. Everyone was for sale. You could basically say, oh, okay, we want to blow this up or that up. Now we have to pay this cop, and we have to pay that NDS guy, and we have to pay the other guy. That's how they did it. And now after 20 years, you have all these philosophical debates about how the West has failed in Afghanistan. Basically, you have created this corrupt system, and it blew up in your face, literally.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's us that are suffering for it. But in any case, so these large-scale attacks that were obviously very civilian heavy in terms of death toll, they were designed for a strategic purpose, right? To create a media storm. So on the one hand, what you have is in rural areas, they're basically cutting off the government. They're basically making it impossible for the government to operate via a mixture of killing civilian workers, of killing opposition imams, and making alliances here and there. So, for example, when I mentioned Ali-Z and Ishaq-Z, there are loads of Ali-Z Taliban.
Yeah.
It's not like the Taliban, Ali-Z, and all of Ishaq-Z and every Ali-Z is on the government side.
Yeah.
No, they would make conscious effort in order to cultivate ties with the other side. So there are, there was even one instance in which I remember I read this. I can't remember where. There was a ban on motorbikes, for example, in Kandahar as well.
Yeah.
And that went, in the early years, that ban was really poorly enforced, right? So the Taliban, in order to make a show of it, they started banning people from driving cars in their areas, right? And only motorbikes, just to show, look who's really in charge. Yeah. Do you see what I'm saying?
It's funny because during the first years of insurgency, the Taliban would buy a lot of motorcycles, okay?
Yeah.
They would buy a lot of motorcycles, and they would give motorcycles to their men. And then there was this story in Western media that the Taliban are recruiting young men to join the insurgency by offering them a motorcycle. So, like, if you always wanted to be a biker, join the Taliban. I'm not sure how accurate that is, that they were actually convincing people to kill themselves for a motorcycle.
They were at one stage, they were offering to outpay the Afghan army. Like, join us and we'll give you 3 times their salary.
But this doesn't make sense to me. Why? Because we know from a lot of people that they have never received a paycheck from the Taliban. And they've been involved.
They did it very strategically at a time in which the lack of payment of So you know the problem of the Afghan army of not paying its
Yeah,
soldiers, of soldiers going hungry, of officers stealing pay, right? They basically just did that announcement just to demoralize the soldiers even further.
yeah, yeah. So what I wanted to say with regards to motorcycles and the bans is that I was watching Humayun Afghan's vlog the other day. I think it was earlier today, and he was walking around Kabul, and he went to a motorcycle repair shop, and he asked him, "How is business?" And the motorcycle repair shop said, "Actually, business is very good." He said, "Why?" He said, "Well, because motorcycles are no longer banned, so everyone, all these Taliban, all these guys are driving motorcycles. But before that, driving motorcycles was banned in a lot of areas." And with regards to Mao and Che Guevara, I would really recommend to our listeners and viewers to read their biographies and the books of Mao and Che Guevara. Uh, there are many biographies of those men, how they exactly fought a guerrilla war in their own time. And if you read those books, if you study them, you will understand insurgency in Afghanistan much, much, much better. And this is something a lot of these counterinsurgency strategies, these Western authors and all these fancy guys that appear in think tank panels and talk, most of them, they haven't done that. Okay? Most of them, they haven't read those books, and they then were put in charge of designing a counterinsurgency strategy in order to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, while they had no idea what kind of strategy the Taliban were actually employing. Okay? So
Yeah.
basically, two opposing sides were fighting a war with each other without actually making an effort to understand what is the opposing side doing, what exactly is their plan.
Well, I think this is one thing. The Americans they basically did their propaganda as everyone does, but then they ended up actually believing it. And then when reality didn't conform to what they lied about and believed, then they blamed Pakistan and called Afghan savages. That is basically the story. But now, so that is the Taliban strategy, and I think just to wrap it up in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So this we've cut the reason I focused so much on the beginning is because this is where the foundational blocks were engraved in stone, right? And these foundational blocks were engraved. This was a choice. Okay. Someone sent me an article today, Sangad, saying it's on foreign policy. I haven't checked the author. I have my suspicions as to who I think the author may be, but the title of the article was "Pakistan is the arsonist in Afghanistan, but wants you to believe it is the firefighter." Have you read it?
Christine Fair. Christine
Okay.
Fair wrote that.
So, and I said to the person, I was like, look, I'm more than happy for Pakistan, its army, its foreign policy to be critiqued. But if it's based on the assumption, if the basis of this argument is America was very good, America had great intentions, and these guys screwed it up, then no, like take it and throw it in the bin. Do you see what I'm saying? So
It's
the
it's
what
it's
I'm
a very it reveals how childish
yeah.
and simplistic they are by explaining away the failures of the United States, NATO, Germany, Britain, France by saying, "Oh, those Pakistanis, they basically ruined everything for us."
Exactly. But now here's the thing. All of these things I'm talking about right now, these were choices. They didn't happen by accident, right? So, but we've covered basic. So now let's quickly whiz over, right? So
Just,
we've got a worsening. Okay.
before that, I was being interviewed today by the LA Times, and
Okay.
they asked me why America failed. Okay,
Uh-huh.
and I said, okay, first you need to define what failure is. If the objective was counter-terrorism, they felt, okay, I gave an explanation to a lot of things. But basically what I try to do is what you just said, is that they were bound by the outcomes of their choices. But because Western societies are democracies where they have elections every 4 years, everyone who is put in charge, a president, he appoints his generals and his ministries of defense, and they have to come up with a strategy. And then before the election, they have to have some results so that the president can be re-elected. And this is a very bad way of waging war in Afghanistan, where basically Bush comes with one strategy, and then before the election, he needs to have something to show to the electorate. Look, this is what I achieved, and it's cosmetic. It's cosmetic. So all the factors that we have discussed so far, the decisions behind them were driven by this desire to win elections, and they didn't really bother understanding what the consequences of those cosmetic changes would be for Afghanistan. And that's why it was a culmination of failure after failure after failure. Please go on.
But yeah, no, so 100%. And like I said, we just, by the way, everyone watching, the cracks that we've shown in the system right from its inception, we could go on in further detail. If you think this is detailed, we could do this live stream for like 12 hours.
Yeah, this is
not.
just we're not even scratching the surface here. Okay.
Yeah, we're genuinely not scratching the surface here. But now here's the thing. So we've established pretty firmly that the cracks were there from the very beginning, right? In terms of even the central government in Kabul, if we assumed that the central government in Kabul was united but weak, that would be bad enough. But it wasn't united, right?
Yes.
So now here's the thing. So when we go to 2014, right, what we've basically got is a series of things whereby security is deteriorating. The Taliban are better equipped. They're better organized. They're taking more territory. The measure of security in Afghanistan is if you can travel the Kandahar and Kabul road, okay? Because the center of political gravity in Afghanistan, and Sangar, correct me if I'm biased, right? But let me finish. The center of political gravity in Afghanistan is the Kabul-Kandahar road, okay? Because through that, generally you go through the provinces such as Wardak, you go through Gardiz, you go through Sharana, you go through Qalat-e-Ghilji. These are sort of the strongholds, right? These are the arteries to Kabul, right? And that is how it's worked historically, right? By 2014, you basically can't go on the high roads between Kabul and Kandahar. I would say maybe even in 2008, it was probably dangerous, right? Ghani becomes president. Now, Ghani becomes president, and who is he running against? He's running against Dr. Abdullah Abdullah. Now, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah is obviously representing a constituency. Which constituency? The Shura-e-Nizar constituency. Now, if you're watching Afghan politics at this stage, you're thinking those guys have basically been ruling since 2001 anyways. Ahmed Masood has been taking $52 million to the United Arab Emirates. No questions, no answers. These guys have got mansions, whatever. So this election, unfortunately, became very ethnic. And Ghani, in the run-up to this election, was basically very vocal that everyone in Bagram and everyone in Pulacharkhi is a Pashtun. This war has devastated and destroyed Pashtun areas. I want peace, so on and so forth. And to be fair to Ashraf Ghani, he wasn't wrong. Pashtun provinces did pay the price, generally, for the war. But now he picked alliances with people, rabid Pashtun Nazis, right? So there are two ways to approach this. Ghani himself was a very sort of ideological, rigid, and insecure man, right? So he wasn't really able to play the game of politics, if you will, in the way of Karzai. Now, his supporters will see that as being redeeming of him. Karzai, they say, was a slimy snake who is ready to get in bed with anyone. Ashraf Ghani is principled. He stands for those ideals, even if it puts his back against the wall. But now here's the thing, that election obviously necessitated him aligning with Dostum on the one hand, as well as people like Sangar, like Ismail Yun, right? Rabid Pashtun nationalists. So the Pashtun thing Ghani presented
Ajizair in Nangrar.
Haji Zahir and Nangarhar. By the way, I think it was who was Haji Zahir's brother? The name, the name I forgot. The vice president who was killed in 2002.
That was his uncle, Abdul Haq.
No, not Abdul Haq. I think it was
Uh,
Din Muhammad.
No, Aji Qadir was Ajizair's father.
There was one of the guys basically from that family that in 2002, so in the Bonn conference, he walked out saying this isn't
That was
Pashtun.
Aji Qadir, the
Okay,
father of Ajizair.
so so Ashraf Ghani allied and basically played up this thing of, there's been 13 years of Pashtuns being excluded, which we could say to an extent somewhat true, but the way in which it was articulated was terrible. Because then Ashraf Ghani came along, and as has been established even in our live chat, basically started doing the same thing that the Masoud Khail started doing, right? So that, but on top of that as well, I think that Ashraf, and I've detailed this in an article saying how Kabul dug its own grave. Uh, Basically, Ashraf Ghani started off very pro-peace and very pro-Pakistan. He thought that if he makes overtures towards Pakistan, they will be able to pressure him, to pressure the Taliban into negotiating with Ashraf Ghani. And he was right. It did work. However, the Pakistanis weren't micromanaging the Taliban in the way that Ghani thought. And then news of Mullah Omar's death came out, right? When news that Mullah Omar had passed away came out, it triggered, basically, it collapsed the negotiations that were in their embryonic phase. Security deteriorated because there was also Taliban infighting, and the Taliban, in order to present a united front, were incentivized to launch and increase further attacks on the regime in Kabul, right? Because if you want to remain a united front, the only way to do that is to start attacking. So the insurgency got even more violent. Okay, then we obviously had Mullah Akhtar Mansour, who was killed in a drone strike in Balochistan, and he was traveling back from Iran. And according to most, the coordinates of his location were passed to the Americans by the ISI, who were not happy with him for various reasons. And then we had Mawlawi Hibatullah Akhundzada, who's the current Emir of Afghanistan. I'm still getting used to it, Sangar.
It's very difficult to process, but that's
I
the
was calling
reality.
him the Taliban Emir up until recently. But Mawlawi Hibatullah Akhundzada, who's the current Emir of Afghanistan, succeeded to the leadership of the Taliban, and that was a very strategic choice because under Mullah Akhtar Mansour, the tribal aspect started to become a flashpoint. Akhtar Mansour was accused, because Akhtar Mansour had his back against the wall, he relied more on tribal connections of fellow isk-p, who General Razik had brutalized, who we haven't actually discussed in this live stream, and I'll leave it to another day. But General Razik had brutalized Nurzi and Ishaq-Z. Mullah Akhtar Mansour relied on that, but that obviously led to a friction with Nurzi. So Mawlawi Hibatullah Akhundzada, who is, according to all sources, not really interested in politics, was agreed upon as the unifying figure and brought many Nurzi back into the Taliban who may otherwise have rebelled. And he obviously kept the Ishaq-Z on side, and he's very a prestigious scholar amongst the Taliban circles. So that's taken us, what, to 2016, and then since then we've had the negotiation process, and we are where we are. Have I glossed over it too much?
Now, for 3 hours, I think almost 3 hours, we've covered a lot of ground. But basically, to sum it up,
We could go on for another 9 hours. This is the thing.
yeah. Here's the thing. Starting this live stream, the idea was, okay, we're not going to talk about how the 9/11 attacks what happened to building number 7, and were there any Israelis jumping on a bridge, all those conspiracy theories, whatever. That's not our focus. We're not interested in any of that, because our primary focus is on Afghanistan, what happened in Afghanistan. And basically, the first part of our conversation, to sum it up, Waleed explained very well how this union of different factions under supervisions of Americans created a regime that was not inclusive. It didn't had any, like, there was no meritocracy. It created a breeding ground for corruption and dysfunctionality, and this has also been a major contributing factor to the rise of insurgency. And as we glossed over all these years,
because we've discussed this is the thing, we've discussed if you want to go over, let's say, the intra-Afghan negotiations, that's been discussed at length, but no one actually goes back. And because everyone is now like, oh my God, how could the Taliban, how could the Americans fail? How did this happen? We have to take it back all the way to 2001, December the 5th, 2001.
Exactly. So, guys, I want to thank you all for joining us today again for an AFGHANEYE Live. We have tried to discuss a lot of issues that we haven't covered before. Obviously, Waleed, the books that you have read, people have asked if you can mention the books. And Nila has asked, can you post a reading list on Twitter, please? We mentioned this in a previous live stream. We are working on a AFGHANEYE reading list. So we will publish an article with a whole list of all the books, and we will stick only to English now, okay? So just English titles that are available either on Amazon or anywhere else. We also want to mention a few articles, very important articles. We will also mention some very important journalists. Obviously, we're going to mention our friends. Imran Feroz. Yeah.
Qazizai,
Imran Feroz, those guys, obviously
Lindsay Billing.
Lindsay Billing.
Yeah,
Andrew Quilty, even though we had a little beef with Andrew, okay, because he launched his own podcast and he said the first podcast about Afghanistan, and then we had a sort of a little clash with him, but we're friends now. Andrew is a very decent guy. He does a lot of good work, and a lot of people love him and appreciate him for what he does. We will mention...
W. Momandi is asking, can you critique books too in your free time? Yeah, that is, believe it or not, W. Momandi, we started this year with like a proper plan for a whole list of articles to write, but I would say the last 2 months specifically have just been a series of events that we didn't expect to happen so quickly that we had to cover.
Yeah, we did critique the book of John Bolton extensively. Barnett Rubin's book, we critiqued it extensively. We critiqued the Afghanistan Study Group report extensively. They're all on our, if you go to check out our podcasts, they're over there. You can listen to them. We sort of...
W. Momandi is also asking, what about Afghan women journalists? And you recommend, yes, Lindsay Billing.
Lindsay Billing is an Afghan Pakistani journalist. She's great. She was our guest. She's a very, very brave journalist. Really. Now, I'm not just saying that. She travels alone across Afghanistan in very dangerous areas. And she's a freelancer, by the way, just like us, just like Imran, just like Qazizai. Laura Caserati, she is basically an honorary Afghan. I think she's originally Italian. She's also a great journalist. So yes, there are a lot of great people. We will mention all of them in our reading list. Most noteworthy articles they have written for Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine. Everything will be covered. So we're working on it. So you guys make sure that when the article is published, that you share it far and wide.
Yeah, so this is the thing, right? Everyone's obviously been inundated. Uh, Everyone has been flooded with the news of Afghanistan for the last over the last 1 month, 2 months, right? But here's the thing, right? No one is telling you how this system was set up to fail in the first place, right? And so here's the thing: I don't expect. Uh, Maiwand Ahmadzai is saying Farah Nasr is a really good Afghan woman journalist you should follow. But here's the thing: look, we take time. This is our weekend, right? We take time out of our day, right, as freelancers who work 5 days a week to read a series of books, recap them, highlight them, etc., so on and so forth, in order to make a general point. And that general point is that you and we together can understand better this conflict that we could say to a large extent, or to, you know, has basically ended as we know it, right? And so understanding that conflict is obviously not easy. It wasn't easy for myself. It wasn't easy for Sangat. It won't be easy for anyone, especially with all of the propaganda that we're inundated with. Now, here's the thing: no one else really is doing that, right? And we are, and I'm always really proud to say this, the only independently operated Afghan media platform that I know of that consists of two people, right, who are fluent in both of Afghanistan's national languages as well as English, and we're dedicated to providing a counter narrative to what you hear about Afghanistan in the world at large in the Anglosphere, right? So if you believe in our cause, right, and that cause is two guys with full-time jobs, sometimes reading during the job to make notes for the live stream that we'll do at night. I hope no one tells my employer that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got my mustache bretuna midasi pazi bandidasi rakam jageji. Uh,
Yeah, you need to do it like this, like I get like,
yeah, but
and then
in any case, sometimes it even means that we have to do the Afghan eye whilst we're at work in terms of reading and whatever. Now we love doing that, but if you agree with that cause, that wait, give me a second, Sangat. I'm going to turn
yeah,
off my camera.
I'm going to tell you guys what I do for the Afghan Eye. So basically, I am in like 6 different group chats with people from Afghanistan. In my list, there are academics, university professors, journalists, people who have been in Afghanistan throughout this 40 years. I call people in Afghanistan via WhatsApp, via Viber, etc. We have conversations with people on the ground, and there's an extended network around us that provide us with a lot of insight. Now the thing is, there's one issue, and that is that a lot of our sources, a lot of our people who provide us with vital information, they're not fluent in English. Okay, they're fluent in Pashto and in Dari, and they live in Afghanistan, but they're not fluent in English. So we try to have some of these guests on our show, and they said because we're not fluent, maybe that's not such a good idea. Uh, but what we do is talk as much as possible with those people, so that we know what we're talking about. Because what, when you're not on the ground in Afghanistan, when you're not traveling across Afghanistan, you miss a lot of details, you miss a lot of insights, and we can't run a podcast and then talk about Afghanistan all day long while not really having our sources. So that's basically my department. I am basically the one who is trying to preserve these connections with people on the ground. And Waleed is our researcher, scholar, investigator,
Whatever you want to call it. But
writer,
yeah, I make
orator.
yeah, I may concur as well. And in terms of sources, I think it's really important that we keep those as well because a lot of people ask us questions, um, and we're able to give an answer that has a lot more depth to it than someone in the West may be able to do so. And that is because we have people whispering in our ears, which is brilliant, right? But now here's the thing: if the point is that you may agree or disagree with some of our political persuasions, you may think we are biased, and of course we're biased. We're human beings. We're not robots, right? But if you agree with the cause of two Afghan Afghans, I don't want to say two Afghan men because someone's going to be like, why don't you tick the diversity quota? In which case, one of us needs to identify as a woman. But in any case, if you agree with the cause of an independent counter narrative toward approaching events in Afghanistan, past, present, and future, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, firstly. Share our content on Twitter. We have, inshallah ta'ala, a lot more articles planned once this period of our activity as the Afghan Eye starts to wind down. We'll come back with the articles. Share our content on Twitter, and most importantly, if you want to get involved in our project, please consider becoming patrons on our Patreon, donating to us on PayPal, or of course the super chats are also very much appreciated, because if you do that, then perhaps one day we will not be compelled to be reading during our work shifts whilst we're working full time.
I
We'll
don't do
actually
that.
be able.
I don't do that.
I may or may not do that. I won't confirm or deny. But the point is that we'd be able to do it full time, and that would obviously mean more content in terms of events past, present, and future.
Yeah, okay. Thank you guys for your company and thank you for your engagement in the chat. Thank you, Wagma Momandi, for all your tweets talking about what was being discussed here. We really appreciate your everyone who is always very actively involved in these conversations. Osama was awake, even though it's late at night in Pakistan, but he was with us for the most part of this conversation. Thank you all for your participation in this conversation and hope to see you guys soon again. When are we going to do another live show?
والله زمان بده ورځو کې شته چې وایي کو چې په کابل کې ډېری خبرې لا روانې دي. نن ورځ خو هغې خبرو باندې مو خبرې ونه کړې په دې چې شل کلنه یعنې کلیزه ده د فشي.
I have tomorrow night. I have a private conversation, a private conference, so I won't be able to do a live stream tomorrow. But I think in the beginning of the next week we will do live shows because we have to cover a lot of material. Again, thank you all very much and see you soon. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum